There are names that echo through history like whispers in the dark. Names that carry with them the weight of mystery, power, and shadow. Grigori Rasputin is one of them. A peasant who walked barefoot through Siberian snow. A mystic who spoke to empresses. A man who refused to die, even when poisoned, shot, and drowned. His story is not simply one of rise and fall. It is a haunting melody of faith and madness, devotion and destruction. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let us walk together through the cold forests of his past, through the gilded halls where he whispered prophecies, and into the icy river where his legend was sealed forever. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the darkness carry you. This is the story of the man they could not kill, the mystic who changed the fate of an empire. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle subscription, a quiet like. Small gestures that help stories like this one find their way to others who seek rest in the arms of history. No rush, no pressure. Just a soft invitation should you feel moved. Now, let us begin. There are places in this world where winter does not merely visit. It settles in like a permanent guest, cold and unforgiving, wrapping itself around every living thing. Siberia is such a place, endless, frozen. A land where the sky stretches so vast and empty that a man can feel both infinite and utterly insignificant beneath it. In the small village of Pokrovskoye, nestled along the banks of the Tura River, life moved slowly, deliberately, like breath on a bitter morning. The people there were hardy folk, shaped by the land they tilled and the faith they clung to with rough, calloused hands. They prayed hard because they had to. They worked harder because survival demanded it. And into this world, on a January night in 1869, when the cold bit deep enough to crack wood and silence even the wolves, Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born. His father, Yefim, was a peasant farmer, a man of few words and fewer prospects. His mother, Anna, bore children the way the land bore crops, with pain, hope, and the quiet knowledge that not all would survive to see spring. Grigori was not their first child, nor their last, but from the beginning, he was different. The midwife who delivered him noticed it first, though she said nothing at the time. The way the infant stared, not with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but with something sharper, older, as though he had been here before. The villagers would later remember these small details, weaving them into the tapestry of legend that would follow him all his days. But on that frozen night, he was simply a baby, crying against the cold, wrapped in rough cloth, held close to a fire that barely held back the darkness. Childhood in Pokrovskoye was not gentle. There were no books, no schools, no soft voices reading bedtime stories beneath warm quilts. There was work. There was prayer. There was the constant negotiation with hunger and cold. Grigori grew as the other children did, barefoot in summer, bundled in layers during the endless winter months. He learned to fish in the river, to tend to livestock, to recognize the signs of changing weather in the behavior of birds and the quality of the wind. But while the other children played, laughed, and eventually grew into the roles their parents had carved out for them, Grigori remained apart. Not by choice, perhaps, but by nature. He spent hours alone, wandering the forests that edged the village, sitting by the riverbank long after the sun had set, staring into water that reflected a sky full of stars he could not name but somehow understood. The villagers began to notice. Whispers started softly, the way they always do in small places where everyone knows everyone else's business. The boy was strange, they said, too quiet, too watchful. Some claimed he could predict when a cow would fall ill, when a storm would come, when death was circling a household. Others dismissed these stories as superstition, the idle chatter of bored minds looking for mystery in the mundane. But then there was the incident with the horse thief. Grigori was only 8 years old when he stood in the village square and pointed directly at a man, declaring in a voice too steady for a child that this man had stolen a neighbor's horse. The accused denied it. The villagers were divided, but when they searched the man's property, they found the horse hidden in a back shed, exactly as the boy had said. After that, the whispers grew louder, more uncertain. Was it a gift? A curse? No one could say. But they watched him more carefully now, with a mixture of fascination and unease. His father tried to beat the strangeness out of him. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The kind of fear that grips a man when he realizes his son will never fit the mold that life has prepared for him. Yefim was a practical man. He needed a son who could plow fields, mend fences, carry on the family name in the unremarkable way peasants had done for generations. But Grigori would not break. He absorbed the blows in silence, his pale eyes never leaving his father's face, and afterward he would return to the river, to the forest, to the places where the world felt less heavy, less defined. His mother understood him better, though she rarely spoke of it. She saw in her son something that frightened and awed her in equal measure. She had grown up with stories of holy fools, wandering mystics who lived on the edges of society, touched by God or madness or both. She wondered, in the quiet hours before dawn, if her son might be one of them. As Grigori grew into adolescence, his strangeness did not fade. It deepened. He began to have visions. Not dreams, but waking visions that came upon him suddenly, like a hand gripping the back of his neck and forcing him to see. He saw a woman in the village weeping over a cradle that would soon be empty. He saw fire consuming a barn 3 days before the flames erupted. He saw faces of people he had never met, speaking words and languages he did not know. These visions left him shaken, exhausted, and more isolated than ever. He tried to explain them once to a village priest who listened with growing alarm before making the sign of the cross and advising the boy to pray for deliverance from whatever dark force had taken hold of him. But Grigori did not feel darkness. He felt clarity, as though the veil that separated this world from something greater, something unseen, had grown thin around him, and he was being given glimpses of what lay beyond. He was 17 when he married Praskovia Dubrovina, a local girl chosen by his parents in the hope that marriage might anchor him, might finally make him settle into the life of an ordinary man. Praskovia was kind, patient, and deeply faithful. She loved him in the way one loves a wild creature that has wandered into your care, with tenderness, but without illusion. She knew he would not stay. They had children together. 3 survived infancy: Dmitri, Varvara, and Maria. Grigori was a father, but fatherhood did not tame him. He provided for them, worked the fields, attended church, went through the motions of peasant life. But inside, the restlessness grew unbearable, like a caged animal pacing back and forth, waiting for the moment the door would open. And then one summer evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the village in amber light, Grigori stood at the edge of the forest and felt it. The pull. Not a voice, but something deeper. a certainty that his life, his true life, lay somewhere beyond the horizon, somewhere far from Pokrovskoye, far from the fields and the river and the familiar faces that had watched him all his days. He did not know where he was going. He did not know what he would find. But he knew, with a conviction that silenced every doubt, that if he did not leave now, he would wither and die in this place, unremarkable and unseen. He left on a morning when the mist hung low over the river, thick and white, as though the world itself had not yet decided whether to wake. Praskovia stood in the doorway of their small wooden home, holding their youngest child against her chest, watching as her husband gathered a few belongings into a worn sack. A change of clothes, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, a small wooden cross that had belonged to his mother. He did not take much because he did not need much. The journey he was beginning was not one measured in comfort or preparation. It was measured in faith, in the willingness to step forward without knowing where the path would lead. She did not cry. She had known this moment would come, perhaps from the very beginning, from the first time she looked into those pale, unsettling eyes and saw something that did not belong to this village, to this life. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the child in her arms. Grigori turned to her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. This woman who had given him children, who had shared his bed and his name, who had never once asked him to be anything other than what he was. "I don't know," he said, and the honesty in his voice was more painful than any lie could have been. He kissed her forehead, touched each of his children's faces with rough, calloused fingers, and then he walked away, down the dirt path that led out of Pokrovskoye, into the mist, into the unknown. The first weeks were the hardest, not because of hunger or cold or the weariness that settled into his bones after long days of walking, but because of the silence. In the village, there had always been noise, the chatter of neighbors, the lowing of cattle, the sound of his children's voices rising and falling like birdsong. But out here, alone on the vast stretches of road that connected one forgotten place to another, there was only the wind and the rhythm of his own footsteps. At night, he would lie beneath the open sky, wrapped in his thin coat, and feel the immensity of the world pressing down on him. He was no one. A peasant with no education, no money, no plan. Just a strange compulsion that had pulled him from the only life he had ever known. In those moments, doubt crept in like frost, whispering that he had made a terrible mistake, that he should turn back before it was too late. But every morning, when the sun rose and painted the horizon in shades of gold and rose, the doubt would fade and the pull would return, stronger than before. He walked east, then south, following rumors and whispers of holy places, of monasteries hidden in the mountains, of elders who had renounced the world and lived in solitude, seeking communion with the divine. He had no map, no guide, only an instinct that seemed to know the way even when his mind did not. He began to meet others on the road, pilgrims like himself, though most were older, their faces lined with years of searching. They shared food with him, stories, prayers whispered in the darkness. They spoke of miracles they had witnessed, of saints whose relics could heal the sick, of visions granted to those who fasted and prayed with sufficient devotion. Grigori listened to all of it, absorbing their words like dry earth absorbing rain. Months passed, then a year. He walked through villages where no one knew his name, where he was simply another wanderer, another seeker. He slept in barns, in churches, on the ground beneath trees that had stood for centuries. He ate when food was offered, fasted when it was not. His body grew leaner, harder, his skin darkened by sun and wind. His hair and beard, once neatly trimmed by Praskovya's careful hands, grew wild and unkempt. He began to look less like a peasant farmer and more like the holy fools he had heard about in childhood. Those strange, unsettling figures who existed on the margins of society, neither wholly accepted nor wholly rejected, tolerated because people feared what might happen if they turned them away. It was during this time that he discovered the power of his presence. He would enter a village and people would stare, not with curiosity, but with something deeper, a kind of instinctive recognition, as though they sensed that he carried something within him, something that set him apart. He did not seek attention, did not preach in the streets or perform miracles for crowds. But when people came to him, and they always came, drawn by rumors or desperation or simple curiosity, he would look at them with those pale, penetrating eyes, and he would speak. Not in the polished rhetoric of educated men, but in simple, direct language that bypassed the mind and struck straight at the heart. He told a woman mourning her dead husband that grief was not an ending but a doorway, and she wept and thanked him and felt, for the first time in months, something like peace. He told a young man paralyzed by fear that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. And the young man left with his shoulders straighter, his jaw set with new determination. Word began to spread. The wandering mystic, the peasant prophet, the man with eyes that could see into your soul. Some sought him out for healing, believing that his touch or his prayers could cure ailments that doctors had declared incurable. Others came seeking guidance, wanting to know what the future held, whether their crops would flourish, whether their children would survive, whether God still remembered them in their suffering. Grigori did not turn anyone away. He listened to their confessions, their fears, their hopes. And then he would speak, or pray, or simply sit with them in silence, and somehow, impossibly, they would leave feeling lighter, as though he had taken some small portion of their burden onto his own shoulders. But the visions grew stronger. They came more frequently now, sometimes without warning, pulling him out of the present moment and thrusting him into scenes he could not fully understand. He saw cities burning. He saw a great palace with walls of gold and windows that reflected a dying sun. He saw a woman with sad eyes and a crown upon her head, weeping over a child who would not stop bleeding. He saw soldiers marching into darkness, their faces hollow with exhaustion and despair. He saw a river running red, not with water, but with something thicker, darker. These visions left him shaken, gasping, as though he had been held under water and then suddenly released. He did not know what they meant, could not piece them together into a coherent narrative. But he felt their weight, their significance, pressing against him like a storm that had not yet broken. Years passed in this way. 3, then 4, then 5. He journeyed to the Grigori monastery, a place renowned for its spiritual power, where monks devoted their lives to prayer and penance. He spent months there, learning from the elders, studying the rhythms of monastic life, absorbing their teachings. But he never took vows. He remained an outsider, a visitor, because deep down he knew that his path would not be one of cloistered devotion. Whatever he was meant to do, it would not happen within the safety of monastery walls. He traveled to Kiev, walking hundreds of miles to visit the sacred caves where saints had lived and died, where their mummified bodies still lay in silent testimony to their faith. He knelt before those ancient remains and prayed until his knees bled, seeking answers, seeking direction, seeking some sign that he was not simply wandering aimlessly, but moving toward a purpose he could not yet see. And then, in the spring of 1903, after nearly a decade of pilgrimage, something shifted. He had arrived in Kazan, a city far larger than any place he had known, bustling with life and noise and the clash of modernity against tradition. He stood in the crowded streets, feeling lost and small, when a man approached him. A priest with kind eyes and a gentle voice. The priest had heard of him, had heard the stories that followed him like shadows. "You are Rasputin," the priest said, not as a question but as a statement. Grigori nodded. "There are people in St. Petersburg," the priest continued, "who would benefit from meeting a man like you. People of faith, people of influence. I believe God has brought you this far for a reason." Grigori stood very still, the noise of the city fading into the background as those words settled over him like a cloak. St. Petersburg, the capital, the heart of the empire, a place as far removed from Pokrovskoye as earth from heaven. He thought of his wife, his children, the village he had left behind. He thought of the visions that had haunted him, the faces he had seen but not yet met. And he knew, with the same certainty that had pulled him from his home all those years ago, that this was the next step. This was where the path had been leading all along. The journey to St. Petersburg took weeks. Grigori traveled with a small group of pilgrims who were making their way north, their feet carrying them toward the great city as if drawn by invisible threads. They walked through forests that seemed to stretch on forever, through small towns where churches stood as the only monuments to faith in an otherwise indifferent landscape. At night, they would gather around fires, sharing what little food they had, and Grigori would listen to their stories. A widow seeking healing for her crippled son. A merchant who had lost everything and was now searching for meaning in poverty. A young woman who claimed to hear the voice of the Virgin Mary in her dreams. Each of them carried their own wounds, their own desperate hopes, and Grigori felt the weight of their suffering as though it were his own. He spoke little during these weeks, preferring to observe, to listen, to let the rhythm of the road work its slow magic on his spirit. But when he did speak, the others fell silent, leaning in to catch his words. He did not speak like the priests they knew, with their formal prayers and carefully constructed sermons. His language was rough, unpolished, drawn from the earth itself. He spoke of God not as a distant judge seated on a throne of clouds, but as a presence that moved through all things, through the wind that rustled the leaves, through the pain that carved lines into human faces, through the love that made a mother weep for her sick child. God is not somewhere else, he would say, his voice low and steady in the firelight. God is here. In the suffering, in the joy, in the moment when you think you cannot go on, and then somehow you do. The pilgrims would nod, their eyes bright with unshed tears, feeling something stir within them that they could not name but recognized as truth. As they drew closer to St. Petersburg, the landscape began to change. The forests thinned. The roads grew wider, more traveled. They began to encounter carriages, soldiers on horseback, merchants hauling goods to the markets of the capital. The air itself felt different, charged with energy, thick with the smell of smoke and progress and human ambition packed too tightly together. Grigori had never seen anything like it. Pokrovskoye had been a village of perhaps a few hundred souls. Even the towns he had passed through during his pilgrimage were small, manageable, places where you could learn every face and name if you stayed long enough. But St. Petersburg was something else entirely. A city of nearly 2 million people, built by the will of Peter the Great on marshland and the bones of the thousands who had died constructing it. A city of grand palaces and squalid slums, of orthodox churches with golden domes and revolutionary ideas whispered in back rooms. A city teetering on the edge of transformation, though most who lived there could not yet see it. When he finally entered this city in the autumn of 1903, Grigori stood for a long moment at the edge of a bridge spanning the Neva River, staring at the water that flowed cold and gray beneath him. The buildings rose on either side like monuments to human pride. Stone and marble and iron forged into shapes that declared permanence, importance, power. He felt small again, as he had on his first days of pilgrimage, but this time the feeling was different. Not the smallness of insignificance, but the smallness of a single seed placed into soil, not yet knowing what it would become, but carrying within it the potential for something vast and unstoppable. He had no money, no connections, no plan beyond the vague assurance from the priest in Kazan that there were people here who might receive him. He wandered the streets, overwhelmed by the noise and movement, the endless tide of humanity flowing past him without seeing him. Beggars sat on corners, their hands outstretched. Street vendors shouted their wares. Women in fine dresses stepped delicately over mud and refuse, their faces hidden behind veils. Soldiers marched in formation, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythmic precision. And through it all, Grigori walked, his rough peasant clothing marking him as an outsider, his wild hair and beard drawing stares and whispers. He found lodging in a cheap boarding house in one of the poorer districts, a cramped room he shared with 2 other men who worked in the factories and came home each night exhausted and reeking of sweat and oil. They paid him little attention, and he was grateful for it. He spent his days walking the city, learning its rhythms, observing the way power and poverty existed side by side, separated by nothing more than a street or a wall or an accident of birth. He visited churches, sitting in the back pews and watching the faithful come and go. He noticed how many of them prayed with a kind of desperate intensity, as though trying to break through some invisible barrier that stood between them and the divine. He noticed, too, the priests who led the services, some sincere, some going through the motions with weary indifference, their faith worn thin by repetition and bureaucracy. It was in one of these churches that he was first noticed by someone who mattered. Her name was Olga Lokhtin, the wife of a high-ranking civil servant, a woman known in certain circles for her deep religiosity and her fascination with mystics and holy men. She had heard rumors of a Siberian peasant who possessed unusual spiritual gifts, and when she saw Grigori sitting alone in the shadows of the church, something in his bearing, the stillness, the intensity of his gaze, convinced her that this was the man people had been whispering about. She approached him after the service, her expensive clothing rustling softly, her perfume a sharp contrast to the smell of incense and old stone. "You are Grigori Rasputin," she said, and again it was not a question. He looked up at her, taking in the fine fabric of her dress, the carefully arranged hair, the eyes that watched him with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Hunger, perhaps for meaning in a life that had been comfortable but somehow empty. "I am," he replied simply. She smiled, a slow, calculating smile. "I have been looking for you," she said. "There are others who wish to meet you, people of faith, people who understand that God speaks through those the world overlooks." She paused, studying his face as though trying to read something written there. "Will you come to my home? Will you share your gifts with those who are seeking?" Grigori considered this for a long moment. He thought of the visions that had brought him here, of the woman with the crown weeping over her child, of the palace with golden walls. He thought of the long road from Pokrovskoye, of the years spent wandering, searching, becoming something he still did not fully understand. And he thought of the pull, that deep, undeniable certainty that had guided him this far and was now pointing him forward, toward this woman, toward the doors she could open, toward a destiny that was beginning to take shape in the shadows. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will come." And so it began. Olga Lokhtin became his first patron in St. Petersburg, introducing him to her circle of wealthy, spiritually hungry friends. They gathered in elegant drawing rooms, these aristocrats and society ladies, sitting on velvet chairs and sipping tea from porcelain cups, while Grigori stood before them in his rough peasant clothes, his boots still carrying traces of mud from the streets. He must have seemed absurd to some of them, laughable even. This wild-looking man with his unkempt hair and his crude speech, speaking to them about God and sin and redemption as though he had some special knowledge they lacked. But when he spoke, something happened. The laughter died in their throats. The skepticism melted from their eyes. They leaned forward, captivated, as his words cut through the polite pretenses and comfortable lies they had built their lives upon. He told them that wealth was not a barrier to salvation, but it was a test. He told them that their sins were not worse than anyone else's, but they were more visible, more dangerous, because they had the power to corrupt others. He told them that God loved them not despite their flaws, but within their flaws, that holiness was not found in perfection, but in the honest struggle towards something greater. And then he would look at them, one by one, with those pale, penetrating eyes, and he would see them, truly see them, in ways they had never been seen before. He would speak to their hidden fears, their secret shamas, their buried hopes, and they would weep. These powerful men and women weep like children in the presence of someone who finally understood. Word spread quickly through the salons and drawing rooms of St. Petersburg's elite. The Siberian mystic, the peasant prophet, the man who could look into your soul and show you the truth you had been hiding from yourself. Invitations poured in. He was asked to attend gatherings, to offer prayers, to bless homes and families. Some sought him out for spiritual guidance. Others came hoping for miracles, for healing, for predictions about the future. Grigori accepted all of it with a kind of bemused detachment, as though he were watching himself from a distance, observing this strange transformation from wandering pilgrim to sought-after holy man. But beneath the growing fame, beneath the attention and the invitations and the whispered reverence, something else was building. A reputation, a shadow. Because Grigori did not behave like other holy men. He drank wine with enthusiasm. He laughed loudly and spoke crudely. He did not shy away from physical contact, embracing both men and women with an ease that some found comforting and others found inappropriate. Rumors began to circulate, quiet at first, then louder, that he held strange gatherings in his apartment. that he preached a doctrine of sin and redemption that sounded dangerously like an excuse for indulgence, that his relationships with the women who flocked to him were not purely spiritual. The rumors were encouraged by those who felt threatened by his rising influence, by priests who saw him as a charlatan, by nobles who resented the way this peasant moved so easily through circles that should have been closed to him. But the rumors did not slow his ascent. If anything, they added to his mystique, to the sense that he was something dangerous and powerful, something that could not be contained by conventional rules. And through it all, the visions continued, growing clearer, more insistent. The woman with the crown, the bleeding child, the palace, the river. He knew, though he did not yet speak of it, that his true purpose had not yet been revealed, that everything so far, the pilgrimage, the arrival in St. Petersburg, the gatherings in elegant drawing rooms, was merely preparation. The real story, the one that would define him and destroy him, was still waiting in the shadows, patient and inevitable as winter. The winter of 1904 arrived early and harsh, wrapping St. Petersburg in layers of ice and snow that turned the grand city into something both beautiful and brutal. The Neva River froze solid, thick enough to walk across, and the wind that swept down from the north carried with it a cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the buildings. Inside the salons and drawing rooms where Grigori now moved with increasing frequency, fires burned in ornate hearths, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light over gatherings of people who had insulated themselves from the suffering that existed just beyond their doors. But Grigori had not forgotten. He had walked those frozen streets. He had seen the beggars huddled in doorways, the children with hollow eyes and empty bellies, the workers who trudged home through the snow with shoulders bent under the weight of exhaustion and hopelessness. He spoke of these things to his wealthy patrons, not with accusation, but with a quiet insistence that made them uncomfortable. "You pray for your souls," he would say, standing before them with his rough hands clasped together, his voice carrying that strange mixture of gentleness and authority that had become his signature. But what of their bodies? What of the ones who freeze while you sit warm? God hears all prayers, but he listens most carefully to the ones spoken with actions, not just words. Some dismissed his comments as the simplistic moralizing of an uneducated peasant. Others felt a stirring of guilt, of recognition, and they would quietly arrange for donations to be made, for food to be distributed, for small acts of charity that eased their consciences without truly challenging their comfortable lives. But Grigori's influence was growing beyond mere moral guidance. People began to seek him out for more tangible interventions. A merchant's wife came to him in desperation, her daughter wasting away from an illness that doctors could neither diagnose nor cure. Grigori went to their home, a modest but respectable dwelling in one of the middle-class neighborhoods, and he sat beside the girl's bed for hours. He did not perform elaborate rituals or speak in mysterious tongues. He simply held her hand, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. Those who witnessed it said the air in the room seemed to change, to grow heavier somehow, as though an invisible presence had entered and was moving through the space with deliberate purpose. When Grigori finally opened his eyes and released the girl's hand, he stood and turned to the mother. "She will eat tomorrow," he said simply, "and the day after, she will walk." The mother wanted to believe, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. Yet the next morning, the girl asked for food for the first time in weeks. And the following day, she rose from her bed and walked, unsteady but alive, back into a world she had been slipping away from. Word of such healings spread like fire through dry grass. Whether they were genuine miracles, the result of psychological suggestion, or simply fortunate timing, mattered less than the fact that people believed. And belief, once ignited, becomes its own kind of power. A high-ranking officer came to him with chronic pain that had plagued him for years, pain that left him unable to sleep, unable to focus, unable to live without the constant presence of suffering. Grigori placed his hands on the man's shoulders and stared into his eyes with such intensity that the officer later said it felt as though his entire life was being examined and weighed in that single moment. "Your pain is not in your body," Grigori told him. "It is in your conscience. You carry guilt for things you have done, things you have ordered done. Until you confess, until you release what you carry, your body will continue to punish you for what your soul cannot forgive." The officer wept there in Grigori's small, sparse apartment and confessed to acts committed during military campaigns, acts that had haunted him every night since. And when the confession was complete, when the words had been spoken aloud and the burden shared, the pain began to fade. Not immediately, not completely, but enough that the officer could sleep that night for the first time in years. These stories multiplied and intertwined, creating a narrative that transformed Grigori from a wandering mystic into something approaching a legend. He was the man who could see what others could not, the man who could heal what medicine could not touch, the man who spoke with God in a language that transcended the formal prayers of the church. But with growing fame came growing scrutiny. The Orthodox Church, which held tremendous power in Russian society, began to watch him with increasing suspicion. Who was this peasant who claimed no formal training, no ordination, no authorization from the ecclesiastical hierarchy? Who was he to minister to the faithful, to perform what appeared to be miracles, to speak with such authority about matters of faith and salvation? Bishops and priests began to investigate, asking questions about his background, his teachings, his methods. What they discovered troubled them. Grigori's theology, such as it was, did not fit neatly into Orthodox doctrine. He spoke of a faith that was deeply personal, unmediated by institutional authority. He suggested that sin and redemption were not simple opposites, but rather part of a continuous cycle, that one could not truly understand grace without first experiencing transgression. Some whispered that he was preaching a form of the Clisti heresy, a banned sect that allegedly practiced ritual sin as a path to spiritual ecstasy. Whether Grigori had any actual connection to the Clisti was never proven, but the accusation itself was dangerous. The church began to quietly campaign against him, warning parishioners about the dangers of following false prophets, about peasants who presumed to understand mysteries that required years of theological study to comprehend. But the church's warnings had limited effect among those who had experienced Grigori's presence firsthand. They had felt something in his company, something that the formal rituals and careful sermons of ordained priests had never provided. They had been seen by him, understood by him, touched by whatever power moved through him, and they were not willing to give that up simply because church officials disapproved. A divide began to form in St. Petersburg society between those who revered Grigori and those who despised him, with very little middle ground between. Dinner parties became battlegrounds of opinion. Friendships fractured over the question of whether this Siberian peasant was a holy man or a dangerous charlatan. And through it all, Grigori himself remained strangely detached, as though the controversy swirling around him was happening to someone else, as though he were simply following a path laid out before him and did not particularly care what others thought about his journey. His personal life during this period remained sparse, almost monastic, despite the accusations of indulgence that followed him. He lived in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, his furnishings simple to the point of austerity. A narrow bed, a table, a few chairs, an icon in the corner where he prayed for hours each day. He ate little, usually whatever was offered to him by those he visited. He slept irregularly, sometimes going days with only brief moments of rest, his mind too active, too full of visions and voices, and the constant pull of whatever force had brought him this far. He sent money back to Pokrovskoye when he had it, to Praskovia and his children, though he did not visit them. That part of his life felt like it belonged to someone else, to a version of himself that had died the morning he walked into the mist and left the village behind. He thought of them sometimes, late at night when the city finally grew quiet and he sat alone in his room with only candlelight and his own thoughts for company. He wondered if his children remembered him, if they understood why he had left, if Praskovia still waited, or if she had accepted that he would not return. He felt guilt about this, a deep, gnawing guilt that he carried like a stone in his chest. But the guilt was not strong enough to pull him back. Whatever he had become, whatever he was becoming, required him to move forward, not backward. The visions made that clear. The woman with the crown was closer now. He had seen her in his dreams with increasing frequency, her face becoming clearer, more defined. She was real. She was waiting. And he was being drawn toward her with the inevitability of a river flowing toward the sea. In the spring of 1905, the city erupted into chaos. It began on a Sunday in January, a day that would later be known as Bloody Sunday, when thousands of workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. They carried icons and sang hymns, these workers, believing that their little father, as they called the Tsar, would hear their grievances and offer relief from the grinding poverty and harsh conditions that defined their lives. But the Tsar was not at the palace that day, and the soldiers who met the marchers did not listen to their songs or read their petitions. They opened fire. Hundreds fell in the snow, their blood staining the white ground red, their hymns cut short by the crack of rifles and the screams of the dying. The massacre shattered whatever remaining faith the people had in the benevolence of their ruler. Strikes erupted across the city. Protests filled the streets. The empire, which had seemed so solid and eternal, suddenly revealed itself to be fragile, held together by force and fear rather than love or loyalty. Grigori watched these events unfold with a mixture of sorrow and recognition. He had seen this in his visions, though not with such clarity. The blood in the snow, the anger rising like smoke, the sense that something fundamental had broken and could not be repaired. He moved through the city during those turbulent months, offering what comfort he could to those who sought him out, praying with families who had lost sons and fathers to the bullets or to the arrests that followed. He did not involve himself in politics, did not speak out for or against the government. His concern was always individual, always personal. The soul in pain, the heart crying out for meaning in the midst of chaos. These were the things that drew his attention and his care. It was during this period of unrest that he received an invitation that would change everything. It came through one of his patrons, a woman named Anna Verubova, who had become devoted to Grigori and spoke of him constantly in the highest circles of society. Anna had connections to the Imperial Court, and she had mentioned Grigori to someone who mattered, someone who had been searching desperately for any source of hope or help. The invitation was carefully worded, discreet, but its meaning was clear. He was being summoned to meet someone of great importance, someone who needed what he could offer, someone who had been waiting, whether she knew it or not, for him to arrive. Grigori read the invitation in his small apartment, holding the expensive paper in his rough hands, and he felt the pull stronger than ever before. This was it. This was the moment all the previous moments had been leading toward. The woman with the crown, the bleeding child, the palace with golden walls. The visions were about to become reality, and he was about to step into a story that would consume him, elevate him, and ultimately destroy him. He set the invitation down carefully, crossed himself, and whispered a prayer not for protection or success, but simply for the strength to face whatever came next. Because he knew, in that deep place where truth lives beyond words, that once he walked through those palace doors, there would be no turning back. His life as a wandering mystic, anonymous and free, was coming to an end. What would replace it, he could not yet fully see. But it was waiting for him, patient and inevitable, and all that remained was for him to step forward and claim it. Before the palaces, before the whispers in gilded halls, before his name became synonymous with scandal and mystery, there were the roads. Endless, winding roads that stretched across the vast body of Russia like veins carrying blood through a sleeping giant. These were the years that shaped him, the years between leaving Pokrovskoye and arriving in St. Petersburg, years spent in constant motion, seeking something he could not name, but would recognize the moment he found it. To understand the man who would one day hold the fate of an empire in his calloused hands, one must first understand the wanderer, the pilgrim, the seeker who walked thousands of miles with nothing but faith and an unshakable conviction that God spoke not through institutions, but through the raw, unfiltered experience of the world itself. Grigori left his village in the summer of 1892, when he was 23 years old and still uncertain whether the pull he felt was divine, calling or simply the desperation of a man who could not fit into the life he had been born to. The first monastery he sought out was Verkhoturi, a place of legend among the faithful, located deep in the Ural Mountains, where the air was thin and cold even in summer. It took him weeks to reach it, walking through forests where bears roamed and wolves sang to the moon, sleeping beneath trees that had stood for centuries, drinking from streams that ran clear and cold as winter itself. He met other pilgrims on these roads, men and women who had given up everything in search of something they hoped might fill the emptiness that civilization had carved into their souls. There was an old woman named Agafya who walked with a cane made from gnarled wood, her face so lined with years and suffering that it looked like a map of a hard life lived without complaint. She had lost 3 children to illness, a husband to drink, and now walked toward holy places, hoping to find some assurance that their suffering had meant something, that God had not simply abandoned them to chaos and pain. She and Grigori walked together for several days, and in the evenings, when they stopped to rest, she would tell him stories of her life, stories filled with small moments of grace that had kept her moving forward when everything else suggested she should simply lie down and wait for death. God is in the details, she told him one night, her voice soft in the darkness. Not in the grand miracles we pray for, but in the way light falls through leaves, in the taste of bread when you're hungry, in the kindness of strangers who share their fire. Grigori never forgot her words, never forgot the way she smiled when she spoke of God, as though talking about an old friend who had stayed faithful through every hardship. When he finally reached Verkhotchuri, Grigori stood outside the monastery gates for a long time, simply staring at the walls that enclosed a life of prayer and renunciation. He had expected to feel something profound, some immediate confirmation that he had arrived at his destination. But what he felt instead was uncertainty. The monastery was beautiful in its austerity, its order, its complete rejection of the chaos and noise of the world. But it also felt separate, removed, as though the monks inside had built walls not just of stone but of theology and ritual, walls that kept them safe but also kept them distant from the very people they claimed to serve. He entered anyway because he had come too far to turn back based on a feeling he could not articulate. And for the next several months, he lived among the monks, learning their rhythms, their prayers, their way of moving through the world with eyes downcast and voices hushed. The monks were kind to him, patient with his lack of education, his rough manners, his tendency to ask questions that made them uncomfortable. He attended services in the chapel, where incense hung heavy in the air, and the sound of chanting seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human voices that produced it. He worked in the gardens, pulling weeds and tending vegetables, finding in the simple repetition of physical labor a kind of meditation that quieted the constant noise in his mind. He fasted on the days prescribed by monastic rule, feeling his body grow lighter, more transparent, as though he were becoming less solid and more spirit. And he listened to the elders, holy men who had spent decades in prayer and contemplation, who spoke of God with a certainty that he both envied and distrusted. One elder in particular took an interest in him. Father Macari was ancient, his body bent like a question mark, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but somehow still seeing more than most men with perfect vision. He would sit with Grigori in the garden during the brief hours of free time, asking him questions about his life, his visions, his reasons for seeking the monastic path. "You are not meant for this life," Father Macari said to him one afternoon, his voice rasping like wind through dry leaves. "You have the gift, but not the temperament. The gift requires you to be in the world, not apart from it. You cannot heal what you do not touch. You cannot guide what you do not walk beside." Grigori felt both relieved and frightened by these words. Relieved because they confirmed what he had been feeling since his arrival. Frightened because if the monastic life was not his path, then what was? Where did he belong? What was he supposed to do with this strange gift that set him apart but gave him no clear direction? God does not always give us clear instructions, Father Macari continued, as though reading his thoughts. Sometimes he simply pushes us forward and expects us to find the way through trial and error, through prayer and pain. You are being pushed, Grigori Yefimovich. You will keep moving until you find the place where you are meant to stop. And when you find it, you will know, not because it feels comfortable, but because it feels inevitable. The old monk smiled then, a smile that held both warmth and sadness, as though he could see the path ahead and knew it would not be easy. "Go," he said gently. "Continue your pilgrimage, but remember, the holiest places are not always the ones marked on maps. Sometimes the holiest place is simply wherever you are standing when you finally surrender to what God is asking of you." Grigori left Verkhotchuri in the autumn, when the leaves turned gold and red and the first frost began to settle on the ground at night. He felt lighter somehow, unburdened by the expectation that he needed to become something specific, that his path needed to look like anyone else's. He walked south toward Kiev, a journey of over 1,000 miles through territories that shifted from forest to steppe, from Russian villages to Ukrainian towns, through landscapes that changed the accents and customs, but not the essential human needs he encountered everywhere. People were suffering. People were searching. People were desperate for something to believe in, something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. And Grigori, with his strange eyes and his unpolished words and his complete absence of pretense, became for many of them a vessel through which they could glimpse something beyond their daily struggle. He developed a reputation during these years of wandering: the holy fool, the starets, the man who walked with God in ways that made the established church nervous. He would enter a village, and within days people would seek him out, drawn by rumors or intuition or simple desperation. They would bring him their sick children, their dying parents, their broken marriages, their unanswerable questions about why life had to be so hard, why God seemed so distant, why faith required so much effort and offered so little certainty. And Grigori would sit with them, his presence alone somehow creating a space where honesty became possible, where the masks people wore could be set aside, where tears could fall without shame. He did not have answers in the way priests had answers, with scripture and doctrine and carefully reasoned theology. What he had instead was a kind of radical empathy, an ability to sit in someone else's pain without trying to fix it or explain it away, to simply be present and allow that presence to become a form of healing. There was a farmer whose crops had failed 3 years in a row, who sat with Grigori by the side of the road and wept with the deep, wrenching sobs of a man who had held everything inside for too long. "God has abandoned me," the farmer said. "I pray, and nothing changes. My family is starving. What am I doing wrong?" Grigori was quiet for a long time, watching the sun set over the fields that should have been golden with wheat, but stood brown and barren instead. "You are doing nothing wrong," he finally said. "Sometimes the land rests. Sometimes we suffer not because we have failed, but because suffering is part of the cycle, like winter following autumn. God has not abandoned you. He is in this pain with you, carrying it alongside you, waiting with you for the season to change." The farmer looked at him with hollow eyes. "How do you know?" he asked. "How can you be sure?" And Grigori smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "Because I have seen the seasons change. Because I have walked through winter and found spring on the other side. Not because I deserved it, but because that is what seasons do. They change. Always." The farmer did not look convinced, but something in his shoulders relaxed slightly, as though the weight had not disappeared, but had become, for a moment, easier to bear. The roads taught Grigori things that no monastery ever could. They taught him that holiness was not found in separation from the world, but in full immersion within it. They taught him that the divine moved through everything. Through the prostitute weeping in a doorway, through the drunk stumbling home at dawn, through the merchant counting coins with trembling hands, through the child laughing in the street despite having no shoes and no certainty of where the next meal would come from. God was not clean and orderly and confined to churches with golden domes. God was messy and contradictory and present in places that made comfortable believers uncomfortable. This understanding set him apart from the religious authorities who would later condemn him. because they believed in boundaries, in hierarchies, in rules that separated the sacred from the profane. But Grigori had walked too far, seen too much, sat with too many broken people to believe in such neat divisions anymore. He reached Kiev in the spring of 1894, after months of walking through mud and rain and the slow awakening of the earth after winter's long sleep. The city rose before him like a vision from another world, its churches and monasteries clustered on hills above the Dnieper River, their golden domes catching the sunlight and throwing it back toward heaven. This was one of the holiest sites in all of Russia, the birthplace of Orthodox Christianity in the eastern lands, a place where saints had lived and died and where their relics still drew pilgrims from across the empire. Grigori felt a mixture of reverence and exhaustion as he approached. He had been walking for nearly 2 years now, and though his spirit remained strong, his body was showing the strain. His clothes were little more than rags. His boots had holes that let in water and cold. His skin was weathered and dark from constant exposure to sun and wind. He looked like what he was, a wanderer, a man with no home and no possessions except the faith that kept his feet moving forward. The Caves Monastery, Petersburg, was his destination. Here, in underground tunnels carved into the hillside, the bodies of Orthodox saints lay preserved, their mummified remains resting in narrow chambers lit by candles that burned day and night. Pilgrims came to these caves to pray beside the dead, to seek intercession, to touch the glass cases that held the bodies and feel some connection to the holy power that had once animated these now silent forms. Grigori descended into the caves with a group of other pilgrims, moving through passages so narrow that his shoulders brushed both walls, the air cool and heavy with the smell of earth and incense and something else. Something ancient and patient that seemed to be watching, waiting, measuring each visitor who entered this underground realm. He knelt before the body of Saint Nestor, a chronicler who had lived 900 years earlier, whose withered hand still clutched a wooden cross, whose face was hidden behind dark, leathered skin that barely suggested the human features it had once possessed. Grigori prayed there for hours, so long that the other pilgrims came and went and came again. And still he remained, his knees aching against the stone floor, his mind emptying itself of thought, until there was only the silence and the darkness, and the sense of standing at a threshold between this world and something beyond it. And in that emptied space, a vision came to him with such clarity that it felt more real than the stone beneath his knees. He saw a great palace, its walls white and gold, its windows reflecting a dying sun. He saw a woman standing at one of those windows, her face pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she stared out at something he could not see. She was beautiful in the way that sadness makes certain faces beautiful, her features refined by grief into something both fragile and eternal. Beside her stood a man in military uniform, his shoulders heavy with responsibility he did not want and could not escape. And in an adjoining room, visible through an open doorway, a child lay in a bed too large for his small body, his face pale as snow, his eyes closed, his breath shallow and irregular. The woman turned from the window and walked to the child, kneeling beside the bed, taking his small hand in both of hers, and Grigori could hear her voice, though he could not make out the words. She was praying, begging, bargaining with God for her son's life. And then, as though sensing his presence across the years and miles that separated them, she turned and looked directly at him, her eyes meeting his in the vision, and he felt the full force of her desperation, her need, her absolute conviction that someone, somewhere, must have the power to save what she could not bear to lose. The vision released him suddenly, and he gasped, falling forward onto his hands, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The cave was silent except for the flickering of candles and the distant sound of pilgrims chanting somewhere deeper in the tunnels. He did not know how long he had been kneeling there. Hours, certainly, perhaps longer. Time moved differently in this place, flowed in ways that did not match the clocks and calendars of the surface world. He pulled himself to his feet, his legs trembling, and made his way back through the narrow passages, up toward the light, toward the air, toward the world that suddenly felt less solid than it had before, as though the vision had torn a hole in the fabric of reality, and he was now seeing through to something more fundamental, more true. He stayed in Kiev for several weeks, sleeping in the monastery's hostel for pilgrims, eating the simple meals provided by the monks, spending his days in prayer and contemplation as he tried to understand what he had been shown. The woman with the sad, beautiful face, the child who hovered between life and death, the sense that he was meant to be there, that somehow his path and theirs would intersect, that this vision was not a possibility but a prophecy, something that would happen whether he willed it or not. He spoke of it to no one, keeping the vision locked inside like a secret too dangerous to share. But it changed something in him, gave his wandering a new sense of purpose. He was no longer simply searching. He was being drawn toward a specific destination, a specific moment in time when everything he had become would be tested and measured, and found either sufficient or wanting. When he finally left Kiev, heading west toward the monasteries of Moldavia and then north again into the heart of Russia, his reputation had grown to the point where people recognized him on sight. The Siberian mystic, the wandering prophet. Stories about him traveled faster than he did, carried by merchants and pilgrims, and anyone who had encountered him and felt compelled to speak of the experience. Some of the stories were true, some were exaggerated, some were invented whole cloth by people who had never met him but found the idea of him useful for their own purposes. It did not matter. The stories created a reality of their own, and that reality pulled people to him like iron filings to a magnet. In a small town in the province of Tambov, a young woman approached him as he sat outside a church, his back against the stone wall, his eyes closed against the afternoon sun. "Are you the one they call Rasputin?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He opened his eyes and looked at her. She was perhaps 20, thin to the point of frailty, her dress clean but worn, her hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "I am Grigori Rasputin," he said simply. "Whether I am the one you seek, I cannot say. What do you need?" She hesitated, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. "My brother," she finally said. "He has lost his faith. He says there is no God, that we are alone in a world that does not care whether we live or die. My parents are heartbroken. They fear for his soul. Can you speak to him? Can you show him that God is real?" Grigori studied her for a long moment, seeing not just her words but the desperation behind them, the family fracturing under the weight of doubt and fear. "Bring him to me," he said. "But understand, I cannot give him faith. Faith is not something that can be transferred like money or bread. I can only offer him my own certainty and hope that it resonates with something inside him that wants to believe." The young woman nodded eagerly and hurried away. An hour later, she returned with her brother, a young man with angry eyes and a defensive posture. His arms crossed over his chest as though preparing for battle. "My sister says you have answers," the young man said, his tone challenging. "I say you have stories, nothing more. Convince me. Prove to me that God exists." Grigori looked at him with those pale, penetrating eyes that had unnerved so many before. "I cannot prove what you are determined not to see," he said calmly. "You want certainty, but faith is not certainty. Faith is walking forward when the path is dark and trusting that the ground will be there when you set your foot down. You have been hurt by life, and so you have decided that if God exists, he must be cruel or indifferent. But what if God is neither? What if God is simply allowing you the freedom to choose? To believe or not believe? To love or to close your heart? You say you do not believe in God, but you are angry at him. You cannot be angry at something that does not exist. Your anger is proof that somewhere inside you, you still believe. You are simply afraid to hope because hope makes disappointment possible." The young man's arms slowly lowered. His jaw tightened as though he were fighting back emotion. "I watched my mother pray every day for my father when he was sick," he said, his voice rough. "Every single day. And he died anyway. What good is prayer if it changes nothing?" Grigori nodded slowly. "Your father died," he said gently. "But your mother's prayers were not wasted. They sustained her through his illness. They gave her something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. They kept her connected to something larger than her pain. Perhaps that is what prayer does. Not change the outcome, but change us. Give us strength to face what we cannot control. Your father is gone, and that is a wound that will never fully heal. But you are still here. Your mother is still here. Your sister is still here. And you have a choice: to let that wound poison everything you touch, or to let it deepen you, make you more capable of compassion, more aware of how precious and fragile this life is." The young man stood very still, tears streaming down his face now, his defenses crumbling like walls made of sand. His sister moved to his side, taking his hand, and they stood there together while Grigori watched with quiet understanding. He did not offer more words. He did not need to. The moment held its own truth, its own small miracle of connection and recognition. After a time, the young man nodded, unable to speak, and turned away, his sister walking with him back toward whatever home and healing awaited them. Grigori watched them go, feeling the familiar exhaustion that came after such encounters, the sense that something had moved through him, using him as a channel, leaving him drained but also strangely peaceful. These were the years that forged him. Not the years in palaces, but the years on the road, walking through dust and mud and snow, encountering pain and doubt and desperate faith in 1,000 different faces. He learned that miracles were rarely dramatic. They were small shifts in perspective, brief moments when someone's burden became lighter, when hope flickered back to life in eyes that had grown dull with despair. He learned that his gift was not in having answers, but in creating space for people to find their own answers, to reconnect with something inside themselves that had been buried under survival and suffering. And he learned, though he could not have articulated it in theological terms, that the divine was not something distant and separate, but something woven into the fabric of human experience, present in every moment of genuine connection, every act of courage, every decision to keep moving forward when everything suggested it would be easier to simply give up. By the time Grigori turned 30 in 1899, he had walked more miles than most men would travel in a lifetime. His feet were calloused, hardened by years of contact with dirt roads and stone paths and forest floors. His face had become a map of his journey, lines carved by sun and wind, and the weight of other people's suffering that he carried with him like invisible baggage. He no longer resembled the young peasant who had left Pokrovskoye. That man had been uncertain, searching, driven by a pull he could not understand. The man who now walked the roads of Russia moved with purpose, even when he did not know his destination. He had become what the roads had made him: a vessel, a bridge, a living connection between the ordinary world and something that existed just beyond the reach of normal perception. It was during this period that the visions became more frequent and more insistent. They no longer came only in moments of deep prayer or meditation. They arrived without warning, pulling him out of ordinary consciousness and thrusting him into scenes that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. He would be walking through a village, and suddenly he would see it overlaid with images of fire, of buildings collapsing, of people running through streets with terror etched on their faces. He would be sitting beside a river, and the water would seem to turn red, thick and dark, while voices he could not identify whispered warnings he could not quite hear. He would close his eyes to sleep, and instead of darkness, he would see the palace again. Always the palace, its white walls glowing in twilight, its windows like empty eyes staring out at a world that was coming apart at the seams. The woman appeared in these visions with increasing clarity. He could see her face now in detail. The high cheekbones, the perfectly arranged hair, the jewelry that marked her as someone of wealth and status, but most of all the eyes, gray-blue and filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. She was always looking for something, searching, her hands moving restlessly, her body tense with the kind of fear that never fully releases its grip. And the child, the boy who lay in that too large bed, his face pale against white sheets, his small body fighting a battle that should not have been his to fight. Grigori did not know who they were, not yet, but he knew with absolute certainty that they were real, that somewhere in this vast empire they existed, and that his path would eventually lead him to them. He spoke of these visions to very few people. Most would not understand, would think him mad or possessed or simply seeking attention. But there were a handful of fellow pilgrims, other wanderers who moved through the world with their own gifts and their own burdens, who recognized in him something authentic, something that transcended the boundaries of normal experience. One such person was a monk named Iliador, whom Grigori met in the city of Tsaritsyn while both were passing through on their separate journeys. Iliador was younger than Grigori, perhaps 25, with the fierce, burning eyes of a true believer and a charisma that drew crowds whenever he preached. He was handsome in a severe way, his features sharp and defined, his voice powerful enough to fill a church without strain. Where Grigori's appeal was intimate, personal, one-on-one, Iliador commanded audiences, spoke to hundreds at a time with a rhetoric that blended orthodox theology with populist anger at the corruption and inequality that plagued Russian society. They met in a monastery courtyard, both seeking a night's shelter, and recognized in each other a kindred spirit, though their approaches to faith could not have been more different. They talked long into the night, sharing bread and weak tea, speaking of their visions, their experiences, their understanding of what it meant to serve God in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to genuine spirituality. "The church has become corrupt," Iliador said, his voice passionate, his hands gesturing emphatically. "The bishops live like princes while the people starve. They preach humility while wearing robes worth more than a peasant earns in a year. We need a cleansing, a return to the true faith, to the simplicity and purity of the early Christians who owned nothing and shared everything." Grigori listened carefully, recognizing the truth in Iliador's words, but also sensing something dangerous in his certainty, in the way his righteousness left no room for nuance or doubt. "The church is made of humans," Grigori said slowly, choosing his words with care, "and humans are flawed. But we are all flawed, brother. You and I included. The corruption you see in bishops, do you not see it also in yourself? The pride? The certainty that your way is the only way? I do not defend the church's failures, but I also do not believe that tearing it down will solve the problem. We do not need destruction. We need transformation. We need people who can sit with the broken and the corrupt and the lost and show them that there is another way, not through condemnation but through love." Iliador frowned, clearly not satisfied with this answer. "Love without justice is weakness," he countered. "You speak of sitting with the broken, but what of those who do the breaking? What of the oppressors? Do we simply love them while they crush the people beneath their boots?" Grigori smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I did not say love was easy," he replied. "I said it was necessary. Justice without love becomes revenge, and revenge feeds on itself until there is nothing left but ashes and blood. I have seen this in my visions, brother. I have seen what comes when anger leads and love follows behind. It is not a future any of us should want." They parted the next morning, Iliador heading north and Grigori continuing east. But their paths would cross again in years to come, and the tension between their different understandings of faith would eventually explode into open conflict. But on that morning, as they said goodbye in the monastery courtyard, they embraced as brothers, two men who shared a desire to serve, but who would ultimately walk very different roads toward very different destinations. Grigori's wanderings took him to places that few from his social class ever saw. He walked to the Black Sea, standing on the shore and staring out at water that stretched to the horizon, feeling the wind that came across from distant lands, from Constantinople and beyond, carrying with it the scent of salt and possibility. He traveled to the Caucasus Mountains, climbing narrow paths that wound through landscapes so beautiful they seemed almost unreal, where peaks touched clouds and valleys held villages that appeared unchanged since medieval times. He spent time in the great monasteries of Mount Athos, though he was not permitted to stay long, his status as a wandering layman making the monks nervous, uncertain how to categorize him or what rules should apply to someone who fit no traditional mold. Everywhere he went, he absorbed knowledge not from books but from experience, from observation, from the countless conversations he had with people from every level of society. He learned that peasants and princes suffered in similar ways, that wealth did not protect against loneliness or fear, or the desperate need to believe that life meant something more than a brief flicker between darkness and darkness. He learned that women often carried heavier burdens than men, their strength hidden beneath layers of social expectation and religious doctrine that told them their value lay in silence and submission. He learned that children saw truth more clearly than adults, their vision not yet clouded by the compromises and rationalizations that accumulate over years of living in a world that rarely rewards honesty. And through it all, the gift that had marked him since childhood continued to grow stronger, more refined, more impossible to ignore. He could look at a person and see not just their face, but the weight they carried, the wounds that had shaped them, the fears that drove their decisions. He could touch someone's hand and feel the illness moving through their body, sense where the energy was blocked, where pain had taken root and refused to release its hold. He could sit in silence with a stranger and create a space where healing became possible, not through any technique or formula, but simply through the quality of his presence, through his absolute willingness to be with someone in their suffering without trying to fix it or explain it away. In a town whose name he would later forget, Grigori encountered a woman who had not spoken in 3 years. Her husband brought her to him, explaining that she had witnessed something terrible. The death of their daughter in an accident that happened so suddenly, there had been no time to prevent it, no chance to say goodbye. Since that day, the woman had been silent, locked inside herself, her eyes vacant, her body moving through the routines of life without any apparent consciousness or will. Doctors had examined her and found no physical cause for her silence. Priests had prayed over her and declared her beyond their help. Her husband was at the end of his hope, bringing her to this wandering mystic as a last, desperate attempt to reach whatever remained of the woman he had loved. Grigori sat with her for an entire day. He did not try to force her to speak, did not bombard her with questions or prayers or reassurances. He simply sat beside her in the small courtyard of her home, occasionally reaching out to hold her hand, mostly just sharing the silence, allowing his own presence to be a kind of anchor, a reminder that she was not alone even in the deep, dark place where grief had taken her. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Her husband brought them water and food, which Grigori accepted, but the woman ignored. And still they sat, two figures motionless in the afternoon heat, connected by something invisible but undeniable. As evening approached and shadows began to lengthen across the courtyard, Grigori felt something shift. The woman's hand, which had been limp in his, suddenly tightened, her fingers gripping his with surprising strength. He looked at her and saw that tears were streaming down her face, silent tears that fell like rain after a long drought. Her mouth opened, and for a long moment nothing came out. Just the attempt, the effort, the muscles remembering how to form shapes they had forgotten. And then, in a voice so soft he had to lean close to hear it, she whispered a single word: "Why?" It was not a question seeking an answer. It was the distilled essence of all human suffering, the cry that rises from every heart that has ever loved and lost, the fundamental protest against a world where beauty and horror exist side by side, and we are given no map to navigate between them. Grigori did not try to answer. He simply held her hand tighter and said, "I don't know. I don't know why, but you are still here, and that means something. Your daughter would not want you to die with her. She would want you to live, to carry her memory forward, to find some way to transform this terrible grief into something that honors what you shared." The woman sobbed then, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere far below the surface, and her husband rushed to her side, holding her as years of locked-away pain finally found release. Grigori stood and quietly walked away, leaving them to their reunion, to the long, difficult process of learning to live again in a world that had been forever changed. He did not know if the woman would fully recover, if she would ever be able to speak of what she had witnessed, if the silence would return when the initial catharsis faded. But he had done what he could. He had been present. He had created space for healing to begin. The rest was between her and God and time. Stories like this followed him everywhere, creating a legend that grew with each retelling. The man who could make the mute speak. The wanderer who saw into souls. The prophet who knew things that had not yet happened. Some of the stories were accurate. Some were embellished beyond recognition. But they all pointed to a truth that even his enemies could not fully deny. Grigori Rasputin possessed something rare and powerful, something that could not be explained by education or training or any conventional understanding of how the world worked. Whether that something was divine gift or dark magic, holy power or dangerous delusion, depended entirely on who was telling the story and what they needed to believe about him. By 1903, when he finally made his way to St. Petersburg, Grigori had been walking for over a decade. He was 34 years old, no longer young but not yet old, his body hardened by travel, his spirit deepened by experience, his gift honed through thousands of encounters with human suffering and desperate faith. He had seen the best and worst of humanity. He had walked through beauty and squalor, through moments of transcendent grace and episodes of crushing despair. And through it all, he had remained true to the pull that had first drawn him from Pokrovskoye, the certainty that he was being led toward something, prepared for something, shaped by the roads into whatever vessel would be needed for the work that lay ahead. The woman in his visions was waiting. The child was waiting. The palace with its white walls and empty eyes was waiting. And Grigori, the wanderer, the pilgrim, the mystic who had walked thousands of miles to arrive at this moment, was finally ready to step off the road and into the story that would consume him, elevate him to heights he could never have imagined, and ultimately destroy him in ways that would ensure his name would be remembered long after the empire he served had crumbled into dust. The year 1905 was a year of blood and trembling. Russia, that vast empire that had seemed so eternal, so unshakable, was coming apart at its seams. The streets of St. Petersburg ran red with the blood of workers who had believed their Tsar would listen, would care, would save them from the grinding poverty that consumed their lives like a slow fire. Bloody Sunday, they called it, that terrible January morning when soldiers opened fire on peaceful protesters carrying icons and singing hymns. The trust between ruler and ruled, already fragile, shattered completely that day. Strikes paralyzed the cities. Mutinies erupted in the military. Revolutionary groups that had once operated in shadows now moved openly, their words finding fertile ground in hearts that had finally learned to doubt the divine right of kings. And within the golden walls of the imperial palaces, far removed from the chaos in the streets yet unable to escape its psychological weight, the Romanov family faced a crisis more intimate and more terrifying than political unrest. Their son, their only son, the heir to 300 years of dynasty, was dying by inches, and no one could save him. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich was born in August 1904 after 4 daughters, a boy at last to secure the succession and ease the anxiety that had plagued Nicholas and Alexandra throughout their marriage. The christening was magnificent, attended by foreign dignitaries and Russian nobility, a celebration that echoed through the empire as proof that God still favored the Romanov line. But within weeks, the rejoicing turned to horror. The infant bled from his navel, a bleeding that would not stop, that resisted every medical intervention. That spoke of something wrong deep in his blood, some terrible inheritance that no amount of prayer or wealth or imperial authority could alter. The doctors delivered their diagnosis with clinical detachment that barely concealed their own fear. Hemophilia, the royal disease, passed through Alexandra's bloodline from her grandmother Queen Victoria, a genetic curse that turned the simple act of living into a constant negotiation with death. Alexandra received this news like a knife to the heart. She had brought this disease to Russia, carried it in her own blood, passed it to her precious son through no fault of her own, but with consequences she would bear for the rest of her life. The guilt consumed her, transformed her from a shy, reserved empress into something harder, more desperate, more willing to grasp at any hope, no matter how unlikely, no matter what others might think. She could not lose him. She would not lose him. Every mother feels this about her child, but for Alexandra, the stakes were even higher. Alexei was not just her son. He was the future of Russia, the heir upon whom the stability of the empire depended. His death would not just be a personal tragedy. It would be a national catastrophe, a sign that God had withdrawn his blessing from the Romanov dynasty, an invitation to chaos and revolution. The boy's childhood, such as it was, became a series of medical crises punctuated by brief periods of fragile normalcy. A bump, a fall, a moment of rough play that would mean nothing to a healthy child could trigger internal bleeding that swelled his joints to grotesque proportions, caused agony so intense that his screams could be heard throughout the palace, left him bedridden for weeks or months at a time. The doctors administered morphine to dull the pain, but they could do nothing to stop the bleeding, nothing to cure the underlying condition. They were helpless, these educated men with their medical degrees and their confident manner, helpless before a disease that had been killing royal children for generations and would continue killing them until the very bloodlines that carried it finally died out. Alexandra watched her son suffer and felt her faith tested in ways she had never imagined. She prayed constantly, desperately, her knees worn raw from hours spent kneeling before icons, her voice hoarse from whispered pleas that seemed to disappear into an indifferent heaven. She consulted doctors from across Europe, brought in specialists who examined the boy and shook their heads and offered nothing but vague reassurances and expensive treatments that accomplished nothing. She grew to distrust them, these men of science who spoke with authority but delivered no results. What good was knowledge if it could not save her son? What use was medicine if it left him screaming in pain while they stood by with their instruments and their charts and their helpless expressions? It was in this state of desperation that she began seeking other solutions, alternatives that the medical establishment dismissed, but which spoke to her growing conviction that science alone would not save Alexei. She consulted mystics, holy men, anyone who claimed to have a direct connection to the divine, anyone who might possess the power that doctors lacked. Most of them were charlatans, performers who said what they thought she wanted to hear, who promised miracles and delivered nothing, who took advantage of a mother's desperate love for profit or influence, or simply the pleasure of proximity to power. She grew skeptical, then bitter, then almost hopeless. But she never stopped searching, because the alternative, accepting that her son would die young, that she would have to watch him suffer and fade and finally slip away, was simply unthinkable. Nicholas, her husband, the Tsar of all Russia, watched his wife's transformation with growing concern. He loved her deeply, had defied convention to marry her despite political pressures to choose someone else, had made her his empress and the mother of his children. But he did not understand her the way she needed to be understood. He was a man of duty, trained from birth to suppress personal feelings in service of the state, to maintain composure even when his heart was breaking. He adored his son, suffered every time the boy cried out in pain, but he faced Alexei's illness with a kind of resigned fatalism that drove Alexandra to distraction. "It is God's will," Nicholas would say, his voice heavy with sorrow, but also with acceptance. "We must trust in His wisdom, even when we cannot understand it." But Alexandra could not accept this, would not accept this. God's will was not some fixed, immutable thing. God could be moved by faith, by prayer, by the intercession of holy people who stood closer to heaven than ordinary mortals. She had to believe this, because without that belief, there was nothing but darkness and the terrible certainty of loss. Into this atmosphere of desperation and fear, in the autumn of 1905, came Grigori Rasputin. He had been in St. Petersburg for 2 years by then, building his reputation among the aristocracy, moving through the salons and drawing rooms with that strange mixture of peasant roughness and spiritual authority that fascinated some and repelled others. Word of him had reached Alexandra through Anna Vyrubova, her closest friend and confidant, a woman deeply religious and deeply devoted to the Tsarina, who spoke of Rasputin with a reverence that bordered on worship. "He is not like the others," Anna insisted, her eyes bright with conviction. "He is genuine. He has real power. I have seen it myself. He looked at me and knew things about me that no one could have known. He prayed over me when I was ill, and the illness left me. He is sent by God. I am certain of it. You must meet him. You must let him see Alexei." Alexandra was hesitant at first. She had been disappointed so many times, had placed her hope in so many false prophets, that she had learned to protect herself with skepticism. But Anna was persistent, and Alexandra trusted her in ways she trusted few others. Finally, on a November evening when snow fell softly outside the palace windows and the city lay quiet under its white blanket, Grigori Rasputin was brought to the Alexander Palace to meet the imperial family. He arrived dressed simply, his clothes clean but clearly peasant clothing, his beard and hair still wild despite obvious attempts to make himself presentable. He did not bow as deeply as protocol required. He did not avert his eyes when addressing the Tsar and Tsarina. He stood before them with a confidence that should have been insolent, but somehow was not, because it came not from arrogance, but from a deep, unshakable certainty about who he was and what he carried within him. Nicholas watched this strange peasant with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He had heard the stories, the rumors, the whispers about Rasputin's behavior and teachings that made church officials nervous. But he was also a father who would try anything to ease his son's suffering, and so he listened as Rasputin spoke, his voice low and steady, his accent thick with Siberian vowels that marked him as an outsider in these refined surroundings. "I do not promise miracles," Rasputin said, his eyes moving from Nicholas to Alexandra and holding there, recognizing in her face the desperation he had seen in so many faces before, the look of someone drowning and reaching for any hand that might pull them to safety. I am only a servant, but I have been given certain gifts, and I place them at your service. Let me see the boy. Let me pray with him, and then we will know what God intends." Alexandra felt something shift inside her at those words. Not certainty, not yet, but something like it. A stirring of hope that she had thought might be dead, but which now showed signs of life, fragile but undeniable. She led Rasputin to Alexei's room, Nicholas following behind, both of them tense with the fear that comes from hoping after too many disappointments. The boy lay in his bed, small and pale, his face drawn with pain from a recent bleeding episode that had swollen his leg and kept him immobile for days. He looked up as they entered, his eyes dull with morphine and suffering, and then his gaze found Rasputin, and something changed. The boy's expression shifted, became more alert, more present, as though he recognized something in this wild-looking stranger that called to him across the distance that pain creates. Rasputin approached the bed slowly, his movements careful, almost reverent. He did not speak immediately, did not rush to fill the silence with prayers or promises. He simply stood there, looking down at Alexei with those pale, penetrating eyes, and then he reached out and placed his hand on the boy's forehead. The touch was gentle but firm, the hand of someone who knew how to comfort without causing pain. And then he began to speak, his voice so soft that Nicholas and Alexandra had to lean close to hear. He did not recite formal prayers. He did not quote scripture. He spoke to Alexei directly, as one person to another, his words simple and direct. "You are strong," he said, "stronger than you know. The pain tries to tell you that you are weak, that you are broken, but the pain is a liar. You are a child of God, and God does not make weak things. Rest now. Let the strength that is already inside you rise up. Let it push back against the pain. I am here with you. You are not alone." The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth and the barely audible sound of Alexei's breathing. Rasputin remained motionless, his hand resting on the boy's forehead, his eyes closed now, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely, some wordless communication that passed between him and the suffering child. Minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, and still he stood there, never shifting his weight, never showing signs of fatigue or impatience. Alexandra watched with her hands clasped so tightly that her rings cut into her fingers, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile magic was being woven in this quiet room. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Alexei's face began to change. The lines of pain that had been etched around his mouth and eyes began to soften. His breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, grew deeper, more rhythmic. The tension that had held his small body rigid began to release, his muscles relaxing as though some invisible hand had lifted a great weight from his chest. His eyes, which had been watching Rasputin with an intensity that seemed beyond his years, slowly closed, and within moments he had slipped into a sleep that looked nothing like the morphine-induced stupor they had become accustomed to. This was natural sleep, peaceful sleep, the kind of rest that heals rather than merely dulls. Rasputin opened his eyes and gently withdrew his hand. He turned to face Nicholas and Alexandra, and they saw in his face the exhaustion of someone who had given something of himself, who had poured out energy that would need time to replenish. But there was also satisfaction there, a quiet certainty that what needed to happen had happened. "He will sleep now," Rasputin said, his voice still soft but carrying complete conviction. The pain has released him. When he wakes, he will be better, not cured. This disease is not something I can cure, not something anyone can cure, but better, stronger, able to bear what he must bear. He paused, his eyes finding Alexandra's and holding them. You must have faith, little mother. Not in me, but in him. He is stronger than you think. Trust him. Trust God, and do not let fear consume you, because fear is a poison more dangerous than any disease. Alexandra felt tears streaming down her face, though she had not been aware of starting to cry. She reached out and took Rasputin's rough, calloused hand in both of hers, pressing it to her lips in a gesture of gratitude that transcended the vast social distance between empress and peasant. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Nicholas stood slightly apart, his face unreadable, torn between relief at seeing his son peaceful and discomfort at the scene unfolding before him, at his wife's obvious devotion to this strange man whose presence violated every rule of protocol and propriety that had governed their lives. But he said nothing. He could not deny what he had just witnessed, could not explain away the transformation in his son's condition. Whatever Rasputin had done, it had worked. For now, that was enough. Rasputin left the palace that night the same way he had come, quietly, without ceremony, disappearing back into the city like a shadow returning to darkness. But something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just another mystic seeking the patronage of the wealthy and powerful. He was now the man who could help the Tsarevich, the only person who seemed able to ease the boy's suffering when all others had failed. For Alexandra, he became something even more. A lifeline, a connection to the divine intervention she had been praying for, proof that God had not abandoned them, that there was hope even in the darkest moments. The improvement in Alexei's condition lasted for days, then weeks. The swelling in his leg gradually subsided. The pain diminished to manageable levels. He was able to sit up, to take food, to smile and laugh with his sisters in ways they had not seen in months. The doctors were baffled, attributing the recovery to the natural course of the disease, to factors they could not quite identify but which surely had nothing to do with the intervention of an illiterate peasant mystic. But Alexandra knew better. She had seen what she had seen. She had felt the shift in the air when Rasputin placed his hand on her son's forehead. This was not coincidence. This was not natural remission. This was a miracle, small perhaps by biblical standards, but a miracle nonetheless, and it had been delivered through the agency of Grigori Rasputin. She summoned him again and then again whenever Alexei showed signs of distress, whenever the bleeding episodes returned and the doctors stood helpless with their morphine and their sympathetic expressions. And each time, Rasputin would come, would sit with the boy, would place his hands on him and speak in that soft, steady voice, and the crisis would pass. Not always immediately, not always completely, but enough. Always enough to pull Alexei back from the edge, to give him relief, to allow him to return to the fragile approximation of childhood that his disease permitted. Alexandra came to depend on these interventions with an intensity that alarmed those around her. She would send urgent telegrams to Rasputin when he was away from the capital, begging him to return, to pray for Alexei, to use his power to save her son from another brush with death. The imperial household staff watched these developments with growing unease. They saw how the Tsarina's eyes would light up when Rasputin arrived, how she would usher him immediately to Alexei's room regardless of the hour, how she would sit with him afterward, and listened with rapt attention as he spoke about faith and God, and the importance of trusting in divine providence. They saw how the formal distance that usually separated the imperial family from everyone else seemed to dissolve in Rasputin's presence, how Alexandra would call him "our friend," with a warmth in her voice that she showed to almost no one outside her immediate family. And they whispered among themselves, these servants and courtiers, whispered about impropriety and undue influence and the dangerous precedent of allowing a peasant such intimate access to the heart of the empire. Nicholas was more conflicted. He could not deny that Rasputin's interventions seemed to help Alexei. The evidence was too clear, too consistent to dismiss. But he also felt the weight of his position, the awareness that every decision he made was scrutinized, judged, used by his enemies to undermine his authority. And Rasputin was becoming a liability in that regard. The rumors about him were growing louder, more scandalous, more difficult to ignore. Stories circulated about drunken revelries, about improper relationships with female followers, about teachings that bordered on heresy. Nicholas heard these stories and did not know what to believe. When he was with Rasputin, the man seemed sincere, humble even, focused entirely on helping Alexei and supporting the imperial family. But he could not be everywhere at once, could not verify or refute every accusation, and the sheer volume of negative reports made it impossible to dismiss them all as malicious invention. He tried, in his careful, diplomatic way, to limit Rasputin's access, to create some distance between the mystic and the imperial family. But Alexandra would not hear of it. Every attempt to restrict Rasputin's visits was met with such fierce resistance from his wife that Nicholas eventually backed down, choosing marital peace over political prudence. He told himself that Alexandra's judgment could be trusted in this matter, that she knew better than anyone what Alexei needed, that a husband's duty was to support his wife, especially in her darkest fears. But beneath these rationalizations lay a growing anxiety, a sense that something was shifting in ways he could not control, that by allowing Rasputin into their lives, they had opened a door that might prove impossible to close. The rest of Russian high society watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and horror. The Imperial Court had always been a place of intrigue, of competing factions and subtle power plays, but the arrival of Rasputin introduced an element of unpredictability that made everyone nervous. He did not follow the rules. He did not respect the hierarchies. He would arrive at the palace in his peasant boots, tracking mud across marble floors, and treat grand dukes and countesses with the same casual familiarity he showed to beggars on the street. Some found this refreshing, even admirable, a reminder that all people were equal before God, regardless of their worldly status. But more found it offensive, a violation of the natural order, a sign that the Romanovs were losing their grip on the traditions and protocols that had sustained their rule for 3 centuries. Among the aristocracy, opinions about Rasputin divided sharply along lines that often had little to do with him personally and everything to do with existing political and social tensions. Those who supported the Tsarina, who admired her devotion to her family and her deep religiosity, tended to defend Rasputin or at least refrain from open criticism. Those who had always viewed Alexandra with suspicion, because she was German-born, because she was shy and awkward in public, because she seemed to hold herself apart from the social obligations of her position, seized on Rasputin as proof of her poor judgment, her dangerous gullibility, her unworthiness to stand beside the Tsar. The mystic became a proxy in battles that had been brewing long before his arrival. his presence amplifying existing divisions until the court resembled less a unified government and more a collection of warring tribes barely maintaining the pretense of cooperation. The Orthodox Church hierarchy watched with particular alarm. They had never fully accepted Rasputin, had questioned his credentials and his teachings from the beginning, and now saw him wielding influence over the imperial family that should properly belong to ordained clergy who had spent years in theological study and religious service. Bishops and metropolitans began to speak out, carefully at first, then more boldly as they realized that others shared their concerns. They questioned whether Rasputin's healing powers, assuming they were real, came from God or from some darker source. They pointed to his behavior, his drinking, his alleged moral lapses, as evidence that he could not be a true man of God. They warned that by elevating him, by giving him access to the Tsarevich and treating him as a holy man, the imperial family was courting spiritual danger and inviting divine judgment. But Alexandra dismissed these warnings with a certainty that bordered on fanaticism. The church officials did not understand, she insisted. They had not seen what she had seen, had not watched their child suffer while doctors stood helpless, had not felt the desperation of loving someone whose life hangs by a thread that could snap at any moment. Rasputin had been sent by God to save Alexei. She believed this with every fiber of her being, and no amount of criticism or scandal or carefully reasoned theological argument could shake that conviction. If the church could not see his holiness, then the fault lay with the church, not with Rasputin. If society condemned him, then society was blind, deaf to the truth that only she could hear because only she had the faith to listen. This certainty, this absolute refusal to doubt, became one of the defining characteristics of Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin. It was born from desperation, sustained by apparent miracles, and hardened by opposition into something inflexible and impenetrable. Every criticism of Rasputin became, in her mind, an attack on her judgment, her faith, her love for her son. Every attempt to separate them became proof of a conspiracy, of dark forces working to deprive Alexei of the one person who could save him. She built walls around this belief, walls that grew higher and thicker with each passing year, until she was effectively isolated from any perspective that contradicted her own, surrounded only by those who either shared her faith in Rasputin or were too afraid of her displeasure to express their doubts. As the months became years, Rasputin's presence in the imperial household transformed from occasional visitor to permanent fixture. By 1908, he had become so entwined with the daily life of the Romanovs that it was impossible to imagine their world without him. He did not live in the palace. That would have been too flagrant a violation of protocol, even for Alexandra's protection to sustain. But he came and went with a freedom that few others enjoyed, summoned by telegram or telephone whenever crisis struck, arriving at all hours to sit with Alexei, to pray over him, to perform whatever mysterious intervention seemed to pull the boy back from the edge time and time again. The pattern became grimly familiar to those who served the imperial family. Alexei would suffer an injury, perhaps a fall while playing with his sisters, perhaps simply a spontaneous bleed with no apparent cause. Within hours, sometimes minutes, the bleeding would begin internally, swelling a joint until the boy's screams could be heard throughout the palace. The doctors would be summoned, would administer morphine, would apply compresses and splints, and all the useless interventions that medical science could offer. And then, when it became clear that nothing was helping, when Alexei's temperature spiked and his small body thrashed with pain that no child should have to endure, Alexandra would send for Rasputin. Sometimes he was in the city and could arrive within hours. Other times he was away, traveling to his village in Siberia or visiting holy sites across Russia. And then desperate telegrams would fly across the wire. "The little one is suffering terribly. Please pray for him. We need you." And from whatever distant place he found himself, Rasputin would send replies that seemed absurd in their simplicity, but which somehow worked. "God has seen your tears. The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much. Let him rest." And inevitably, impossibly, Alexei would begin to improve. The fever would break. The swelling would subside. The crisis would pass. Whether this was coincidence, whether Rasputin possessed some genuine power, whether his interventions worked through psychological mechanisms that medicine was only beginning to understand, these questions were debated endlessly by those who observed from outside. But for Alexandra, there was no question. Rasputin could save her son. Therefore, Rasputin must be protected, defended, kept close at any cost. This dependency gave Rasputin a power that extended far beyond the sick room. Alexandra came to trust his judgment not just in matters of Alexei's health, but in broader questions of faith, morality, and even politics. She would consult him about appointments to government positions, about whether to trust certain ministers, about how to respond to the growing unrest that continued to simmer throughout the empire. Rasputin's advice on these matters was often surprisingly astute. He had a peasant's understanding of how ordinary Russians thought and felt, insights that the aristocratic ministers who surrounded Nicholas lacked completely. He warned that the people were hungry, that they needed to see their rulers as compassionate rather than distant, that harsh repression would only feed the fires of revolution rather than extinguishing them. But his influence was also unpredictable and sometimes disastrous. He had favorites among the government officials, men he had met through his various connections in St. Petersburg, and he would recommend them for positions they were unqualified to hold. Some of these recommendations were motivated by genuine belief in the person's character or abilities. Others seemed driven by personal loyalty, by gratitude for past favors, or by more mercenary considerations that Rasputin's defenders preferred not to examine too closely. And because Alexandra trusted Rasputin's judgment absolutely, and because Nicholas had learned that arguing with his wife about Rasputin only led to tears and recriminations, these recommendations often resulted in appointments that weakened the government and provided ammunition to those who claimed the Romanovs were unfit to rule. The situation was made worse by Rasputin's continued behavior outside the palace walls. He had moved into a larger apartment in St. Petersburg, funded by donations from wealthy patrons who sought his favor or his prayers, or simply the cachet of being associated with the man who had the Serena's ear. This apartment became a kind of court in itself, where petitioners would gather hoping for an audience, where Rasputin would hold forth late into the night, drinking wine and speaking of God and sin and redemption in ways that scandalized those who heard second-hand reports. Women flocked to him, drawn by his reputation and his charisma, and something in his presence that seemed to reach into hidden places and awaken desires they had been taught to suppress. Whether he actually engaged in the orgies and debauchery that his enemies accused him of remains unclear, obscured by layers of rumor and politically motivated slander. But his behavior was certainly unconventional enough to provide ample material for those who wanted to destroy his reputation. He would appear in public places, restaurants, and taverns, already drunk or becoming so, loud and boisterous in ways that drew attention and comment. He would speak crudely, using peasant expressions that made fine ladies blush and their husbands bristle with offense. He would boast about his influence with the imperial family, claiming that he could make or break careers with a word to the Tsarina, that ministers trembled before him, that he held the fate of Russia in his rough, unwashed hands. Some of this was drunken exaggeration, the bragging of a man who had risen from nothing and could not quite believe his own transformation. But some of it was true, or true enough, and that made it dangerous. The police kept files on him, thick folders filled with reports from agents who followed him through the city, who documented his visits and his visitors, who collected every scrap of gossip and accusation. They recorded his trips to bathhouses where he would sit naked in the steam with both men and women, behavior that was traditional in Russian peasant culture, but deeply shocking to the upper classes who learned of it. They noted the women who came to his apartment and sometimes stayed until morning, though whether these visits were spiritual consultations or something more carnal remained frustratingly unclear to Kuss, investigators who wanted clear evidence of wrongdoing. They documented his drinking, his cursing, his casual disregard for the social conventions that governed behavior in the capital. And all of this information flowed upward through official channels, landing eventually on the desks of ministers and grand dukes who saw in it an opportunity to undermine the influence of this peasant upstart. Several times, delegations of concerned officials approached Nicholas, presenting him with evidence of Rasputin's misconduct, urging him to ban the mystic from court, to break his wife's dependence on this dangerous charlatan before it was too late. Nicholas would listen with his characteristic politeness, would thank them for their concern, and then would do nothing. Or rather, he would raise the matter with Alexandra, tentatively suggesting that perhaps they should be more careful about Rasputin's access, that perhaps the criticism had some merit and should be addressed. And Alexandra would respond with fury unlike anything Nicholas encountered in any other aspect of their marriage. How dare they attack our friend? How dare they spread vicious lies about a holy man who asked nothing for himself and devoted his life to helping others? Did Nicholas not remember what Rasputin had done for Alexei? Did he not understand that without Rasputin their son would already be dead? The accusations were lies, all of them, spread by enemies of the throne, by people who wanted to destroy their family, by the devil himself working through weak and envious men. Faced with this passionate defense, Nicholas would retreat, would apologize for doubting, would promise to ignore the critics and continue supporting Rasputin. It was easier than fighting, less painful than seeing his wife in distress, and besides, he could not entirely dismiss her argument. Rasputin did seem to help Alexei. That was undeniable. And if the price of his son's relative health was tolerating a mystic whose personal behavior left much to be desired, well, perhaps that was a price worth paying. Nicholas had been raised to sacrifice personal preferences for duty, and if protecting Rasputin had become part of that duty, he would bear it as he bore so many other burdens of his position. But the cost of this protection was higher than Nicholas fully understood. With each scandal that was ignored, with each accusation that went unanswered, Rasputin's reputation darkened, and that darkness began to spread to the imperial family itself. People began to whisper not just about the mystic, but about the Tsarina who defended him so fiercely. Was she his lover? The suggestion was absurd to anyone who knew Alexandra, who understood her rigid morality and her deep religious conservatism. But absurd suggestions, repeated often enough, begin to seem plausible. Was she under some kind of spell, controlled by dark powers that worked through Rasputin? This theory found more adherents, especially among those inclined to believe in such things. Was she simply a fool, gullible and weak, unfit to stand beside the Tsar? This was perhaps the most common view among the aristocracy, who had never fully accepted the German-born empress and now saw confirmation of all their prejudices. The situation worsened considerably with the outbreak of war in 1914. When Russia entered the First World War against Germany and Austria-Hungary, patriotic fervor temporarily united the empire, pushing aside the internal conflicts that had been tearing at its fabric. But as the war dragged on, as Russian soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands in battles they could not win with equipment they did not have, as defeats mounted and the home front suffered under shortages of food and fuel, that unity crumbled. People looked for someone to blame, and they found Alexandra with her German birth and her strange mystic advisor who seemed to wield inexplicable influence over imperial policy. Nicholas made the fateful decision in 1915 to take personal command of the army, leaving St. Petersburg to live at military headquarters far from the capital. His motivations were honorable. He felt he needed to be with his soldiers, to share their hardships, to provide leadership at this critical moment. But the practical effect was to leave Alexandra effectively in charge of the government, consulting with ministers, making decisions about appointments and policy, trying to manage an empire she did not fully understand while dealing with a war effort that grew more desperate by the day. And in this enormous task, her primary advisor was Grigori Rasputin. The ministers who had to work with this arrangement found it intolerable. They would craft careful policy recommendations based on expertise and analysis, only to have them overruled because Rasputin had whispered something different to Alexandra, because our friend felt that a particular minister could not be trusted, or that a specific course of action would anger God. Capable officials were dismissed and replaced with Rasputin's favorites, men whose primary qualification was loyalty to the mystic rather than competence in their assigned roles. The government lurched from crisis to crisis, its effectiveness crippled by constant turnover and the widespread belief that policy was being made not in official chambers but in the apartment of an illiterate peasant who understood nothing of statecraft or modern governance. In the streets and taverns of St. Petersburg, the jokes grew darker, the criticism more open. Cartoons appeared showing Rasputin as a puppet master, pulling strings attached to tiny figures of the Tsar and Tsarina. Songs were sung in which the mystic was depicted as the real ruler of Russia, making decisions while drunk and surrounded by women. The name Rasputin itself became a curse word, synonymous with corruption and incompetence, and the decay of everything the empire once represented. And through it all, Alexandra remained convinced that the criticism was unjust, that Rasputin was being persecuted for his holiness, that God was testing their faith and they must not waver. Rasputin himself seemed to sense that his time was running out. The visions that had guided him for so many years now showed him his own death, violent and cold, at the hands of people who believed they were saving Russia by destroying him. He spoke of this to Alexandra, telling her that if he died, the imperial family would not long survive him, that his life and theirs were bound together in ways neither fully understood. She dismissed these dark prophecies, or tried to, though they haunted her dreams and added to the anxiety that had become her constant companion. He was being melodramatic, she told herself. He was tired, worn down by the constant attacks and the heavy burden of his responsibilities. They would protect him. They would keep him safe. Russia needed him. Alexei needed him. Nothing would be allowed to happen to our friend. But in the grand palaces and aristocratic mansions of St. Petersburg, other conversations were taking place. Conversations about duty and sacrifice. Conversations about how to save Russia from the disaster that everyone could see approaching. Conversations that circled back again and again to the same conclusion: Rasputin had to die. Not arrested, not exiled, but killed, removed permanently so that his influence would die with him, and perhaps the imperial family could be saved from the consequences of their disastrous dependence on this mad peasant mystic. The conspiracy was forming, drawing in men of high birth and patriotic conviction, men who believed that murder, in this case, was not a crime but a necessity, a terrible duty that history would vindicate even if the law condemned. And Grigori Rasputin, the peasant from Pokrovskoye, who had walked 1,000 miles to reach this moment, continued his work, praying over Alexei when the bleeding came, advising Alexandra on matters great and small, drinking and talking late into the night with whoever would listen, waiting with a strange calm for the destiny he had seen coming since the first visions found him in those Siberian forests so many years ago. By 1911, Grigori Rasputin had become more than a man. He had become a symbol, a lightning rod for every fear and frustration that plagued Russian society in those twilight years of the empire. To his supporters, he represented authentic spirituality in an age of hollow ritual, the voice of the common people reaching into palaces that had grown deaf to their suffering. To his enemies, he was everything wrong with Russia made flesh: corruption, superstition, the dangerous influence of the uneducated over those who should have known better. The truth, as is so often the case, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. But truth mattered less than perception, and the perception of Rasputin had become so poisoned by scandal and rumor that separating fact from fiction became nearly impossible, even for those who knew him personally. The whispers had begun almost from the moment he arrived in St. Petersburg, quiet at first, confined to small circles of gossip among servants and minor nobility who watched his rise with a mixture of fascination and distaste. But as his influence grew, as his access to the imperial family became undeniable, the whispers grew louder, more confident, more willing to speak truths and half-truths and outright lies with equal conviction. They said he was a member of the Klisti, that banned religious sect that allegedly practiced flagellation and ritual orgies as paths to spiritual ecstasy. They said he preached that sin was necessary for redemption, that one had to fall completely before one could truly rise, a doctrine that conveniently justified whatever debauchery he wished to engage in. They said he seduced women by promising spiritual enlightenment, that his apartment was a den of vice where the boundaries between prayer and pleasure had been erased. Some of these accusations had kernels of truth buried within them, though twisted and exaggerated beyond recognition. Rasputin's theology, such as it was, did emphasize the intimate connection between sin and grace. The idea that understanding one required experiencing the other. This was not particularly radical. It echoed themes found in Orthodox mysticism and even in the writings of certain church fathers. But in Rasputin's rough, unschooled expression, stripped of careful theological framework, it could sound like permission for excess, an excuse to indulge every appetite and call it holy. His relationships with women were genuinely unconventional. He embraced them physically, held their hands, sat close enough that their bodies touched, behavior that violated the careful social distance that was supposed to exist between men and women outside of marriage. Whether these contacts were purely spiritual, expressions of a peasant culture that was more physically demonstrative than aristocratic society, or whether they sometimes crossed into sexual territory, remained a subject of endless speculation and investigation. The police certainly tried to find definitive proof. They assigned agents to follow Rasputin constantly, to note everyone who visited his apartment, to record his movements and conversations, and anything else that might provide ammunition for those who wanted him destroyed. These surveillance reports make for fascinating reading, filled with meticulous detail about the mundane and the scandalous side by side. Rasputin went to the market and bought fish. Rasputin entertained 3 society ladies in his apartment for 2 hours. Rasputin visited a bathhouse and remained there until midnight. Rasputin was observed intoxicated on Nevsky Prospect, speaking loudly about his influence with the imperial family. The reports accumulated in thick files, documenting a life lived largely in public. Yet somehow the smoking gun that would definitively prove sexual misconduct or heresy remained elusive. There were suspicious circumstances, certainly. Questionable associations. Behavior that suggested impropriety. But hard evidence, the kind that could be presented in court or used to force his removal from the imperial circle, remained frustratingly absent. Part of the difficulty lay in the nature of Rasputin's appeal. The women who came to him, and they were many, often wealthy and educated women whose devotion scandalized their families, genuinely believed in his spiritual power. They sought his blessing, his prayers, his guidance in matters of faith and personal crisis. To them, his physical informality was not threatening but comforting, a sign that he did not hold himself apart like cold, distant priests who preached humility while maintaining their own dignity. When he took their hands and looked into their eyes and spoke of God's love in language they could understand, they felt seen and valued in ways they rarely experienced elsewhere. If some of these encounters took on an erotic dimension, whether consummated or simply felt as an undercurrent beneath spiritual conversation, it did not necessarily negate their religious significance. Human experience is complex, and attraction, spiritual devotion, and genuine transformation can coexist in ways that make moralistic judgment seem simplistic. But to the men whose wives and daughters disappeared into Rasputin's apartment for hours at a time, these nuances meant nothing. They saw only a peasant charlatan taking advantage of gullible women, using religious pretense to gain access to intimate spaces and vulnerable moments. Husbands complained to police. Fathers demanded investigations. Brothers spoke darkly of taking matters into their own hands if official channels would not address the situation. And always, the reports would flow upward to officials who would bring them to Nicholas, who would raise the concerns with Alexandra, who would dismiss them as malicious slander and demand that her husband protect their friend from these baseless attacks. The cycle repeated endlessly, each iteration adding to the frustration of those who believed they were watching the empire destroy itself and could do nothing to stop it. The newspaper coverage made everything worse. Russia in the early 20th century had a relatively free press, at least by the standards of autocratic regimes, and journalists seized on the Rasputin story with enthusiasm. Here was everything readers wanted. Sex, power, religion, conspiracy, all wrapped up in a narrative about a mysterious peasant mystic who controlled the royal family. Articles appeared with increasing frequency, each one more sensational than the last. Some attempted serious investigation, interviewing people who knew Rasputin and trying to separate truth from rumor. Others abandoned any pretense of journalism and simply printed whatever scandalous accusations they could find or invent. Rasputin became a fixture in the popular press, his name appearing so often that even Russians who never followed politics or high society knew who he was and had strong opinions about what should be done with him. One incident in particular fed the flames of scandal and would be referenced for years afterward as evidence of Rasputin's depravity. In the spring of 1911, he visited his home village of Pokrovskoye, traveling back to Siberia after several years of absence. The trip was meant to be a rest, a return to his roots, a chance to see his wife Praskovia and his children who had continued living their peasant lives while he moved through palaces and society drawing rooms. But Rasputin could not escape his fame even in the remote village of his birth. A young Orthodox monk named Iliador, the same fiery preacher Rasputin had befriended years earlier during his wandering days, had become increasingly hostile to the mystic as Rasputin's influence grew. Iliador's revolutionary zeal and his populist denunciations of church corruption had initially aligned with Rasputin's own critique of hollow religiosity. But he had come to see Rasputin not as an ally but as a corrupter, someone whose unconventional behavior brought shame on genuine spiritual seekers and provided ammunition to those who dismissed all mysticism as fraud. Iliador arranged for Rasputin to visit his monastery while in Siberia, and what happened there remains disputed. According to Iliador's later account, he and another bishop confronted Rasputin, demanding that he confess his sins and submit to proper church authority. They claimed that Rasputin boasted of his sexual conquests, that he showed them letters from aristocratic women that contained language suggesting romantic or sexual relationships, that he mocked their attempts to control him by pointing to his protection from the imperial family. Rasputin's version was quite different. He said he had been ambushed, threatened, that his former friend had turned on him out of jealousy and political calculation, that the letters had been stolen from him and their contents misrepresented. Whatever the truth, Iliador emerged from the encounter with several letters allegedly written by the Tsarina and her daughters to Rasputin, letters whose intimate tone would be used to suggest improper relationships, though their actual content was more likely the effusive religious sentiment that was common in correspondence between believers and their spiritual advisors. Iliador did not keep these letters private. He could not resist the temptation, or perhaps felt the moral obligation, to expose what he saw as Rasputin's corruption and the imperial family's dangerous delusion. Copies of the letters began to circulate among church officials, then among members of the Duma, Russia's parliament, and finally into the hands of journalists who published excerpts with commentary that turned innocent expressions of gratitude and affection into evidence of scandal. "My dear and irreplaceable friend," Alexandra had written in one letter, "how painful it is without you. My soul is only resting and relaxing when you, my teacher, are sitting beside me." To modern readers, this might seem merely the language of deep religious devotion, the kind of intimacy that exists between a spiritual director and a troubled soul seeking guidance. But in the fevered atmosphere of 1911 Russia, with suspicions already running high, these words were read as something darker, more carnal, proof that the German-born Tsarina had fallen under the erotic spell of a Siberian peasant. The damage was catastrophic. Alexandra's reputation, never strong among the aristocracy who found her cold and distant, collapsed almost entirely. She became, in the popular imagination, not a devoted mother desperately trying to save her son, but a weak woman controlled by a lustful mystic, possibly his lover, certainly his puppet. Political cartoons appeared showing Rasputin as a towering figure with Alexandra and even Nicholas as tiny dolls in his pocket. Songs circulated in taverns with lyrics too obscene to print, describing in graphic detail the alleged sexual relationship between the empress and the peasant. None of it was true, or rather, none of it could be proven true, but the denials came too late and were too weak to counter the narrative that had taken hold. Nicholas was urged by his ministers to act decisively to banish Rasputin permanently, to make a public statement distancing the imperial family from the mystic and his alleged crimes. For once, the Tsar seemed ready to comply. The scandal had grown too large to ignore, the political cost too high to continue bearing. He summoned Rasputin to the palace and, in a conversation that must have been extraordinarily difficult for a man who hated confrontation, told him that he needed to leave St. Petersburg to return to Siberia and stay there until the controversy died down. Rasputin accepted this exile with a calm that surprised those who witnessed the encounter. He did not argue or plead. He simply nodded and said that he would go if that was what the Tsar wished. But he warned, as he had warned before, that his absence would have consequences. "The little one needs me," he said quietly. "Without my prayers, the illness will return. I have seen it. But I will go because you ask it of me." He left St. Petersburg in early 1912, traveling back across the vast expanse of Russia to Pokrovskoye, back to the village where his strange journey had begun so many years ago. His wife received him with the patient resignation of a woman who had long ago accepted that her husband belonged to forces beyond her understanding or control. His children, now nearly grown, regarded this famous stranger with a mixture of pride and confusion. He was their father, but he was also someone else entirely, someone whose name appeared in newspapers, whose actions were debated in the capital, whose presence seemed to carry weight and significance that had nothing to do with the simple rhythms of village life. Rasputin settled back into Pokrovskoye as best he could, working his father's old land, attending the village church, trying to be ordinary in a way that was no longer possible for him. But in St. Petersburg, in the Alexander Palace, Alexei's health began to deteriorate. It started with minor symptoms, bruises that appeared without cause, joints that ached and swelled slightly. Alexandra watched with growing alarm, sending for doctors who examined the boy and assured her that these were normal fluctuations in his condition, nothing to worry about unduly. But she knew better. She had seen this pattern before. The warning signs that preceded the terrible bleeding episodes that left her son screaming in agony. She sent telegrams to Rasputin in Siberia, "Think of us. Pray for us," and he would reply, "God sees your tears. The boy will not die. Have faith." But the telegrams were not enough, not the same as his physical presence, his hands on Alexei's forehead, his voice speaking those simple, powerful words of comfort and command. In October 1912, the crisis that Alexandra had feared finally arrived, and it was worse than anything they had experienced before. The imperial family was staying at their hunting lodge in Spala, Poland, a retreat meant to offer rest and relaxation away from the pressures of the capital. Alexei, feeling well enough to play, was riding in a carriage with his mother when the vehicle jolted over rough ground. It was nothing, a minor bump that would not have registered in the consciousness of a healthy child. But for Alexei, it was catastrophic. The jarring motion triggered internal bleeding in his groin and abdomen, and within hours he was writhing in pain so intense that morphine barely touched it. His screams filled the lodge, audible in every room, unbearable to hear, but impossible to stop. The doctors were summoned, the best specialists that could be found. and they examined the boy and shook their heads with the helpless expressions that Alexandra had learned to dread. The bleeding was internal, inaccessible to their instruments and techniques. They could do nothing but wait and hope that it would resolve on its own, though privately they admitted to each other that they doubted the boy would survive. His temperature climbed dangerously high. His legs swelled to grotesque proportions, the skin stretched tight and discolored. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and when he was awake, he begged his mother to let him die, told her he could not bear the pain anymore, that death would be better than this endless agony. Alexandra sat beside his bed day and night, refusing food, refusing rest, holding his hand and praying with an intensity that frightened those who witnessed it. She looked like she was aging in real time, her face becoming gaunt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and terror. Nicholas, torn between his duties as Tsar and his anguish as a father, sent urgent messages to his ministers about affairs of state while spending every possible moment at his son's bedside. The rest of the imperial children were kept away, told only that their brother was very ill, shielded from the truth that he might be dying. And outside the lodge, servants whispered and wept, while in St. Petersburg and across the empire, people waited for news, some praying for the Tsarevich's recovery, others already composing the announcements and articles that would mark his death and the end of the Romanov succession. For 11 days, Alexei hovered between life and death. The doctors told Alexandra to prepare herself, that the end could come at any moment, that she should say goodbye while her son could still understand her. A bulletin was drafted, carefully worded to inform the empire that its heir was in critical condition and unlikely to recover. The church prepared prayers for the dying. Alexandra, pushed beyond the limits of what any mother should have to endure, finally sent a telegram to Rasputin, thousands of miles away in Siberia, a message that carried all her desperation in a few brief words. Doctors hopeless. Pray for us. Rasputin's response arrived the next day. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much. It was absurd. The boy was dying. The finest medical minds had examined him and found the situation hopeless. What could prayers from Siberia possibly accomplish that prayers at his bedside had not? But Alexandra clung to that telegram as a drowning person clings to driftwood, reading and rereading the words, drawing from them a strength and certainty that reason could not provide. She ordered the doctors to reduce their interventions, to give Alexei space, to let him rest rather than constantly examining and prodding him. They complied reluctantly, convinced they were watching a mother's denial prevent her from accepting the inevitable. And then, impossibly, Alexei began to improve. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, unmistakably, he turned away from the edge of death and began the slow journey back toward life. The fever broke. The swelling began to subside. The pain diminished to levels that allowed him to sleep naturally rather than existing in a morphine haze. Within a week, he was sitting up. Within 2 weeks, he was able to smile at his sisters and speak to his parents in full sentences. Within a month, though still weak and requiring careful monitoring, he was out of immediate danger. The doctors were baffled, attributing the recovery to factors they could not identify, to the natural course of the disease, to anything except what Alexandra knew with absolute certainty. Rasputin had saved him. Again, the Spala crisis transformed Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin, from deep trust into something closer to religious devotion. He was no longer simply a gifted healer or a holy man. He was God's instrument, sent specifically to preserve her son's life, and therefore to preserve the Romanov dynasty and Russia itself. Without him, Alexei would have died at Spala. The doctors had said so. The evidence had been clear. But Rasputin's prayers, sent across thousands of miles, had accomplished what medicine could not. This was proof, undeniable and sacred, that he was protected by divine power. That criticizing him was not merely slander but blasphemy. That defending him was not political calculation but spiritual necessity. Nicholas felt it too, though less intensely than his wife. He had been there, had watched his son dying, had prepared himself to lose the child he loved more than anything in the world. And then Rasputin's telegram had arrived and Alexei had recovered. Coincidence? Perhaps. But Nicholas had lived through too many of these crises, had seen too many times the correlation between Rasputin's interventions and his son's improvement, to dismiss it as mere chance. His rational mind struggled with it, tried to find explanations that fit within a worldview shaped by modern education and secular governance. But his heart, his father's heart, told him that Rasputin had power that transcended rational explanation, and that whatever scandal that power brought with it, it was a price worth paying for his son's life. Rasputin returned to St. Petersburg in early 1913, his exile ended by necessity and by the imperial family's renewed conviction that they could not manage without him. He came back to a city that was even more divided about him than before. His supporters, emboldened by the miracle at Spala, spoke of him with even greater reverence, claiming that his ability to save the Tsarevich from such distance was proof of his holiness. His enemies, enraged by his return and the continued imperial protection that made him untouchable, redoubled their efforts to destroy him through exposure and scandal. The attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously. Newspapers published new allegations almost weekly, each more sensational than the last. Orthodox church officials preached sermons warning about false prophets and the dangers of superstition masquerading as faith. Members of the Duma, the parliament that Nicholas had been forced to create after the 1905 revolution, began openly discussing Rasputin, demanding investigations into his influence and his behavior. One representative, a man named Gachkov, stood before the assembly and spoke for over an hour about the threat that Rasputin posed to the empire, reading from police reports and witness testimony, painting a picture of a regime captured by a degenerate mystic while the country crumbled around them. Nicholas tried to suppress these discussions, using his authority to prevent newspapers from printing Rasputin's name, forbidding the Duma from officially investigating matters that touched on the imperial family's private affairs. But these heavy-handed tactics only made things worse, adding fuel to the perception that the Tsar was more concerned with protecting his wife's favorite than with addressing legitimate concerns about governance and morality. The whispers grew into open conversation, the careful criticism became bold accusation, and Rasputin's name became synonymous with everything that was wrong with the autocratic system that had ruled Russia for centuries. The year 1914 brought war, and with war came a transformation in how Russians viewed everything, including Rasputin. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in July and Russia mobilized to defend its Slavic ally, patriotic fervor swept through the empire like a cleansing fire. Millions of men marched to recruiting stations, eager to fight for Tsar and country. The strikes and protests that had plagued the cities vanished overnight, replaced by rallies and demonstrations of loyalty. Even St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd, shedding its German-sounding name for something more purely Russian. In that first flush of unity, it seemed possible that the war might actually save the regime, might provide the common purpose and shared sacrifice that could heal the divisions tearing Russian society apart. Rasputin opposed the war from the beginning. This was not a popular position. In fact, it was dangerous, marking him as potentially disloyal, possibly even treasonous in an atmosphere where questioning the war effort could get you arrested or worse. But Rasputin had seen too much suffering, had sat with too many grieving mothers and widows, to embrace the romantic nationalism that made war seem glorious to those who had never experienced its reality. He warned Alexandra that war would be a disaster for Russia, that the empire was not prepared, that the military was corrupt and incompetent, that millions would die for nothing. "It will be the end of everything," he told her, his voice heavy with certainty born from visions that had shown him fields of corpses and rivers running red. "The little father will lose his crown, and the people will lose everything. Do not let them push Russia into this madness." But his warnings went unheeded. Nicholas felt trapped by obligations and alliances, by the expectations of his generals and his people, by a sense that backing down would show weakness and invite revolution. Russia went to war, and Rasputin's grim predictions began to come true with horrifying speed. The Russian army, massive in numbers, but poorly equipped and worse led, threw itself against German and Austrian positions and was slaughtered. Entire regiments were wiped out in days. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers went into battle without adequate ammunition, sometimes without rifles, expected to pick up weapons from the dead. By the end of 1914, Russia had suffered over 1 million casualties, and the war that everyone said would be over by Christmas had settled into a grinding stalemate that devoured men and resources with no end in sight. The disasters at the front created opportunities for Rasputin's enemies to attack him in new ways. Rumors began to spread that he was a German spy, that his opposition to the war was not based on humanitarian concern, but on secret orders from Berlin, that he was feeding information to the enemy through Alexandra, who was after all German by birth and therefore potentially disloyal. These accusations were absurd. Rasputin had no access to military secrets and no connections to German intelligence. His opposition to the war was perfectly consistent with his general philosophy of peace and his specific understanding of Russia's weaknesses. But in wartime, logic matters less than emotion, and the emotional appeal of a conspiracy theory that explained Russian defeats as the result of treachery rather than incompetence was too powerful for many people to resist. The suspicions about Alexandra were even more damaging. She had been born Princess Alex of Hesse, a German principality, and though she had converted to Orthodoxy and embraced Russian culture with fierce devotion, her origins could not be erased. In peacetime, this had been merely an inconvenience, a source of minor social discomfort. In wartime, as Russian soldiers died fighting Germans, it became a crisis of legitimacy. People began referring to her as the German woman, speaking the words like a curse. They claimed she was in secret communication with her relatives in Germany, that she was deliberately sabotaging the war effort, that she and Rasputin were working together to ensure Russian defeat. None of this was true. Alexandra was as loyal to Russia as anyone, perhaps more so because she felt the need to constantly prove that loyalty. But truth could not compete with the need for scapegoats, for simple explanations for complex disasters. Nicholas's decision in 1915 to take personal command of the army made everything worse. He left Petrograd for Stavka, military headquarters, hundreds of miles from the capital, believing that his presence at the front would inspire the troops and bring order to the chaotic military command structure. But his departure left a power vacuum in the capital, and Alexandra filled it. She began attending ministerial meetings, corresponding with government officials, making decisions about appointments and policy. She was acting, in effect, as regent, running the empire while her husband focused on the war. And in this role, she relied heavily on Rasputin's advice. The ministers who had to work with this arrangement found it intolerable and absurd. Here was the empress, a woman with no training in governance or politics, no understanding of the complex machinery of modern state administration, making decisions about matters she could barely comprehend, guided by a peasant mystic whose own understanding of politics was limited to folk wisdom and personal intuition. The results were predictable. Capable ministers who questioned Rasputin's influence were dismissed and replaced with his favorites, men whose primary qualification was that our friend trusted them. The government lurched from crisis to crisis, unable to effectively manage the war effort or address the growing problems on the home front. Its credibility shattered by constant turnover and the widespread belief that policy was being dictated not by expertise, but by the whims of a mad monk. One appointment in particular became symbolic of the entire disastrous arrangement. In September 1915, Alexandra engineered the dismissal of the Minister of Internal Affairs and his replacement with Alexei Kvostov, a man Rasputin had recommended. Kvostov was incompetent and corrupt, a political operator who had convinced Rasputin of his loyalty while actually plotting to use the position for his own advancement. Within months, the appointment was recognized as a disaster, but getting rid of Kvostov proved difficult because he had Rasputin's protection. The entire episode was played out in public, in newspapers, and in Duma debates, with every detail becoming fodder for those who argued that the empire was being run by idiots and charlatans while soldiers died and the people starved. The economic situation was deteriorating rapidly. The war effort consumed resources that should have gone to maintaining civilian life. Food became scarce in the cities as the railway system, pushed beyond its capacity, failed to transport goods efficiently. Fuel shortages meant people froze in their apartments during the brutal Russian winter. Inflation spiraled as the government printed money to finance the war, destroying the savings of the middle class and making it nearly impossible for workers to afford basic necessities. Strikes returned, despite the patriotic unity of 1914, because hunger and cold are more powerful than nationalism. And in every strike, in every breadline, in every protest, someone would mention Rasputin's name, blaming him for the misery, claiming that he and the German Empress were deliberately destroying Russia from within. By 1916, Rasputin had become the most hated man in Russia. Even people who had never been to Petrograd, who had never seen the imperial family or paid attention to court politics, knew his name and cursed it. He was blamed for everything. For military defeats, for food shortages, for the deaths of sons and husbands, for the general sense that the world was falling apart and no one in power cared enough to stop it. Political cartoons depicted him as a demon, a serpent, a grotesque figure with wild eyes and grasping hands, reaching into the palace and controlling the royal family like puppets. Songs about him grew more obscene, describing his alleged sexual relationship with Alexandra in graphic detail that was meant to outrage and humiliate. In taverns and factories and even in aristocratic salons, people spoke openly about the need to remove him, to save Russia by destroying the monster who had captured the throne. Rasputin felt the hatred pressing in from all sides. The police protection that had once been relatively subtle became overt, armed guards following him constantly because the threats against his life had become too numerous and too specific to ignore. He was attacked on the street multiple times. Once, a woman approached him with a knife and tried to disembowel him, screaming that he had destroyed Russia and deserved to die. He survived only because guards intervened, and even then the wound was serious enough that he spent weeks recovering. The woman, when questioned, said she had acted on instructions from God, that killing Rasputin was a holy duty, a service to the nation and to heaven itself. She was sent to an asylum, but many Russians, even some in the government, sympathized with her motivation, if not her methods. The attacks were not all physical. His mail was filled with death threats, letters promising that his days were numbered, that justice would find him no matter how many guards the Empress provided. Anonymous packages arrived at his apartment containing dead animals, voodoo dolls, crude threats drawn in blood-red ink. The surveillance intensified, with police agents now assigned not just to track his movements, but to protect him, though it was unclear whether they were protecting him from assassins or simply documenting his activities for the files that continued to grow thicker with each passing month. His apartment, once a place where people gathered for spiritual conversation and wine-soaked discussions of faith, became a fortress, its doors guarded, its visitors screened, the atmosphere tense with the knowledge that danger could arrive at any moment. Inside the palace, Alexandra remained fiercely defensive of her friend, but even she could see that the situation was becoming unsustainable. She begged Rasputin to be more careful, to avoid public places, to stop drinking so much, to at least create the appearance of propriety that might quiet some of the criticism. He would agree, promise to reform, and for a few days or weeks he would be more circumspect. But then the old patterns would reassert themselves. He would appear drunk at a restaurant, or make inappropriate comments to journalists, or allow himself to be seen with women whose reputations were questionable, and the scandal machine would roar back to life with fresh ammunition. Part of his behavior seemed almost self-destructive, as though he were courting the disaster he knew was coming. He spoke openly about his own death, telling anyone who would listen that he had seen it in visions, that he knew he would be murdered, that his body would be thrown into water, and that his death would be followed by catastrophe for the imperial family. "If I am killed by simple peasants, you, Tsar of Russia, have nothing to fear," he reportedly said to Nicholas in one conversation. "But if I am killed by nobles, by your relatives, then none of your family will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people." Whether he actually said these words, or whether they were invented later to fit the narrative of prophecy fulfilled, they captured the dark fatalism that seemed to grip him in his final years. Nicholas was caught in an impossible position. He could see the political damage that Rasputin's continued presence was causing. His ministers told him daily that the mystic had to go, that the empire could not survive if people believed the throne was controlled by a mad peasant. His relatives, Grand Dukes, and other members of the Romanov family spoke even more bluntly, warning that revolution was coming if things did not change, that Rasputin had become the symbol of everything people hated about the autocracy. But every time Nicholas considered acting on these warnings, every time he contemplated finally, permanently removing Rasputin from their lives, he would look at Alexei and remember Spala and all the other times when the mystic's interventions had seemed to save his son's life. And Alexandra would remind him, with tears streaming down her face, that without our friend they would lose Alexei, that God had sent Rasputin to them, and rejecting him would be rejecting divine providence itself. So Nicholas did nothing, paralyzed by the impossible choice between political necessity and paternal love, between saving the empire and saving his son. And while he hesitated, while he tried to navigate between these competing demands, the conspiracy was forming. The men who would finally solve the Rasputin problem gathering in secret, planning the murder that they believed would save Russia from the abyss. In drawing rooms and private clubs, in conversations whispered behind closed doors, the decision was made. Rasputin had to die. Not arrested, not exiled again, but killed, removed so permanently that his influence would die with him, and perhaps the imperial family could still be saved, could still step back from the edge of the catastrophe that everyone could see approaching. The conspirators believed they were patriots, that they were acting out of love for Russia, that history would remember them as heroes who sacrificed their personal honor to serve a greater good. They did not know, could not know, that killing Rasputin would solve nothing, that the damage was already done, that the empire was already falling, and no single murder could arrest its descent into chaos and revolution. But they believed, and belief, as Rasputin himself knew better than anyone, was powerful enough to move mountains, to perform miracles, or to justify the cold-blooded murder of a man who had walked a long road from Siberian obscurity to become the most infamous figure in Russia. A man whose death would be as strange and terrible as his life, a death that would become legend and ensure that his name would echo through history long after everyone who had known him personally had turned to dust. December 1916 arrived in Petrograd with the kind of cold that reaches into your chest and tightens around your heart. A cold that makes every breath feel like swallowing knives. The city was dark, not just with the early darkness of northern winter, but with the deeper darkness of a nation losing hope. The war ground on, swallowing men and resources with no end in sight. Food lines stretched around blocks, women standing for hours in temperatures that could kill, hoping to buy bread that might not be there when they finally reached the front of the queue. In the factories, workers whispered about strikes and revolution, about how much more they could bear before something had to break. And in the palaces and mansions where the wealthy still lived in relative comfort, conversations turned again and again to the same subject. Rasputin must die. Prince Felix Yusupov was 29 years old, strikingly handsome, fabulously wealthy, married to the Tsar's niece, and convinced that he had been chosen by fate to save Russia. He moved through the highest circles of society, a favorite at parties and gatherings, known for his charm and his slightly scandalous reputation. He dressed flamboyantly, sometimes in women's clothing for costume parties, behavior that raised eyebrows but was tolerated because of his status and his genuine charisma. But beneath the playboy exterior was a man who took his aristocratic responsibilities seriously, who believed that with great privilege came great duty, and who had watched with growing alarm as Rasputin's influence pushed the empire toward collapse. He had met Rasputin several times, had even cultivated a friendship with him, gaining the mystic's trust while secretly planning his destruction. It was a performance that required considerable skill, pretending warmth while harboring murder, and Yusupov carried it off with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He was not acting alone. The conspiracy included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a Romanov cousin close to the Tsar, a young man of 25 who represented the imperial family's desperation to distance themselves from the scandal that Rasputin had become. There was Vladimir Purishkevich, a member of the Duma known for his ultra-nationalist views and his passionate speeches about the need to purge Russia of corrupting influences. There was Dr. Stanislaus Lazavert, who would provide the poison, and Sergei Sakotin, an officer who would provide military support if things went wrong. Together, they represented different segments of Russian society: aristocracy, royalty, political establishment, professional class, all united in the conviction that killing one man could somehow reverse the momentum toward disaster. They met in secret throughout November and early December, gathering in Yusupov's palace or in other private locations where they could speak freely without being overheard. The planning took on an almost theatrical quality as they debated methods and timing and how to dispose of the body afterward. Yusupov insisted that he should be the one to lure Rasputin to the palace, that he had the relationship with the mystic that would allay suspicion. The others agreed, though they also agreed that the actual killing should be a group effort, that no one person should bear the full weight of this act. They decided on poison first, cyanide mixed into wine and cakes, enough to kill several men. If the poison failed, they would shoot him. If shooting failed. But shooting would not fail. They were not worried about that. How much could one man endure? Rasputin, for his part, seemed to be walking toward his death with his eyes open. The visions that had guided him throughout his life now showed him his end with terrible clarity. He spoke about it to Anna Vorobova, to Alexandra, to anyone who would listen. "They are going to kill me," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, as though discussing the weather. "I have seen it, water, cold, darkness. But do not worry, little mother. God will take care of me. And when I am gone, you will understand what I meant to you." Alexandra dismissed these dark prophecies, or tried to, telling herself that he was simply exhausted, worn down by the constant attacks and the pressure of his position. But she felt fear curling around her heart, cold and insistent, whispering that he was right, that they were running out of time. On the evening of December 16th, Yusupov sent word to Rasputin that he wished to speak with him urgently, that he needed spiritual guidance for a personal matter, and would Rasputin do him the honor of visiting the Yusupov palace late that night? There was additional bait. Yusupov's beautiful wife Irina would be there, and she was eager to meet the famous mystic. This last part was a lie. Irina was not even in Petrograd. But Rasputin had expressed admiration for her beauty in the past, and Yusupov calculated that the prospect of meeting her would overcome any hesitation. He was right. Rasputin agreed to come, though he told his daughter Maria, who had come to stay with him in Petrograd, that he felt uneasy about the visit, that something seemed wrong, but he could not identify what. "If I am not back by morning," he told her, "go to the Tsarina. Tell her where I went." Yusupov arrived to collect Rasputin around midnight, driving through empty streets where snow fell softly and muffled every sound. The city was asleep, or pretending to be, everyone shut inside against the cold and the darkness, and the sense that something terrible was brewing just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Rasputin emerged from his apartment building wearing his best clothes, a white silk shirt embroidered with cornflowers, velvet trousers, and a heavy coat against the cold. He had bathed and combed his hair and beard, making himself presentable for what he believed would be a social visit. As he climbed into Yusupov's car, did he feel the presence of death waiting? Did some instinct scream at him to run? If so, he ignored it, settling into the seat beside the prince and making small talk as they drove through the frozen city toward the palace that would be the last place he would see. The Yusupov Palace was one of the grandest in Petrograd, a massive structure that spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries, of power so old and established that it seemed permanent as stone. Yusupov led Rasputin not to the main floors where nobles entertained and conducted their social lives, but down to the basement, to a room that had been specially prepared for this night. It had been decorated to look inviting, almost cozy, with a fire burning in the hearth and furniture arranged to suggest comfort and intimacy. On a table sat plates of cakes and carafes of wine, innocent-looking refreshments that carried death in every bite, every sip. The cyanide had been provided by Dr. Lazavert, who had crushed the crystals and mixed them into the food and drink with amounts that should have killed a man within minutes. Upstairs, the other conspirators waited, listening for sounds from below, for the cry or crash that would signal that the poison had worked. They were nervous, chain-smoking cigarettes, pacing back and forth, the weight of what they were about to do settling on them like a physical burden. Murder, even murder they believed was justified, was still murder, and none of them had killed before. They tried to distract themselves, to focus on the righteousness of their cause, on the Russia they were saving, but the reality kept intruding. They were about to end a human life, and no amount of political justification could make that feel comfortable. In the basement, Yusupov offered Rasputin wine and cakes, urging him to eat and drink while they waited for Irina, who Yusupov claimed would be down shortly. Rasputin accepted, drinking the poisoned wine in large gulps, eating the poisoned cakes while chatting casually about politics and faith and the state of the empire. Yusupov watched with growing horror as nothing happened. Rasputin did not clutch his throat, did not collapse, did not show any sign of distress. He simply continued eating and drinking and talking, as though consuming enough cyanide to kill 5 men was no more consequential than having tea. Minutes passed, then an hour. Yusupov excused himself and went upstairs to consult with the others. "He's eaten everything," he told them, his voice tight with panic. "He's drunk the wine. Nothing is happening. The poison isn't working." The conspirators gathered in frantic whispered consultation, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Had the poison been defective? Had it somehow been neutralized by the heat or the sugar in the cakes? Or was Rasputin truly protected by some dark power that made him immune to ordinary means of death? Dr. Lazavert was particularly shaken, insisting that he had used more than enough cyanide, that no human being should have been able to survive even a fraction of what Rasputin had consumed. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last as they debated what to do next. Finally, Perishkevich pressed his revolver into Yusupov's hand. "Shoot him," he said bluntly. "We cannot wait any longer. Just finish it." Yusupov returned to the basement, the gun hidden behind his back, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to do this. How to transition from host offering hospitality to executioner delivering death. Rasputin looked up as he entered, and for a moment their eyes met, and Yusupov thought he saw something in the mystic's gaze. Knowledge, perhaps, or resignation, as though Rasputin understood exactly what was about to happen and had accepted it. "You would do well to look at the crucifix and say a prayer," Yusupov said, his voice unsteady, gesturing to an ornate cross mounted on the wall. It was a strange thing to say, a kind of warning disguised as spiritual advice. Rasputin turned to look at the crucifix, and in that moment, Yusupov raised the gun and fired. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, the sound reverberating off stone walls and seeming to shake the very foundation of the building. Rasputin cried out and fell backward, clutching his chest where blood was already beginning to spread across his white silk shirt. He collapsed onto the floor, his body twitching once, twice, then going still. Yusupov stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, smoke rising from the barrel, unable to quite believe what he had just done. Upstairs, the other conspirators heard the shot and came running down the stairs, crowding into the room to see Rasputin's body lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. They checked for a pulse, found none, and after a moment of stunned silence, began to congratulate themselves. It was done. Russia was saved. They were heroes, patriots who would be celebrated once the truth could be told. They left Rasputin's body where it lay and went upstairs to plan the disposal. They would wrap the corpse in cloth, weight it down, and throw it through a hole in the ice of the Neva River, where it would sink and never be found. By the time anyone realized Rasputin was missing, the evidence would be gone, and they could deny any involvement. Yusupov, however, felt compelled to return to the basement one more time, drawn by some impulse he could not name. He approached the body cautiously, staring down at the face that was now waxen and still, the eyes closed, the mouth slightly open. And as he stood there, looking at what he had done, Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened. The mystic's hand shot out with shocking speed, grabbing Yusupov by the throat, fingers closing like a vice around his windpipe. Yusupov screamed, a high, terrified sound that brought the others running once again. Rasputin was pulling himself upright, using Yusupov's body as leverage, his face contorted with rage and pain and a terrible determination to survive. His lips moved, forming words that Yusupov would later claim were a curse, though in his panic he could not make them out clearly. With strength born of pure terror, Yusupov tore himself free and scrambled backward, falling over furniture in his haste to escape those grasping hands. Rasputin rose to his feet, swaying but upright. One hand pressed against the wound in his chest, blood flowing between his fingers. He looked at the conspirators gathered in the doorway, looked at them with eyes that seemed to see through them to their souls, and then he turned and ran. Not toward them, but away, toward the stairs that led up and out, toward the door and the street and possible escape. He moved with horrifying speed for a man who should have been dead, taking the stairs two at a time, leaving a trail of blood behind him like breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale. The conspirators stood paralyzed for a crucial few seconds, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. Then Pokrovskoye broke the spell, pushing past the others and racing up the stairs in pursuit, his own revolver drawn. He emerged into the palace courtyard just in time to see Rasputin running across the snow-covered ground toward the gate, toward the street beyond where people might hear him if he screamed for help, where this carefully planned murder might turn into a public disaster. Stop, Pokrovskoye shouted, raising his gun. Rasputin did not stop, did not even slow down. Pokrovskoye fired twice, both shots missing in the darkness and the snow. He steadied himself, aimed more carefully, and fired a third time. This bullet struck Rasputin in the back, and he stumbled, falling forward into the snow. But even then, he did not die. He was crawling now, pulling himself forward with his hands, leaving a dark trail in the white snow, still trying to reach the gate, still fighting for life with a tenacity that went beyond anything human. Pokrovskoye walked closer, aimed carefully at the fallen figure, and fired once more. This bullet struck Rasputin in the head, and finally he stopped moving. Pokrovskoye stood over him, breathing hard, watching for any sign of continued life. But Rasputin lay still now, his face pressed into the snow, the back of his head a ruin of blood and bone. The others came running out, drawn by the shots, and together they stood in a circle around the body, staring down at what they had done. It had taken poison that should have killed him instantly, a bullet to the chest, 2 bullets to the back, and a final shot to the head. And even then, even after all of that, they were not entirely sure he was dead. They were afraid to touch him, afraid that somehow he might spring to life again, might grab them with those terrible hands and drag them down into whatever darkness he was descending into. It was Grand Duke Dmitri who finally stepped forward and kicked the body hard, once, twice, testing for any response. There was none. Rasputin was dead. Finally, impossibly, he was dead. But they could not leave him there in the courtyard where servants or passers-by might see. They had to complete the disposal as planned, had to make the body disappear, so that questions about his death might be delayed or confused. They wrapped him in a heavy cloth, binding it tight, and carried him to a car. The body was heavier than they expected, dead weight that seemed to resist their efforts. And they struggled with it, slipping on the bloody snow, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They drove through the empty streets to the Neva River, to a bridge where they knew there was a hole in the ice, a place where the current ran strong enough that anything thrown in would be carried away. They stopped the car at the bridge, and in the darkness lit only by distant street lamps, they pulled Rasputin's body from the vehicle and carried it to the railing. They did not unwrap him, did not look at his face one last time. They could not bear to. They simply lifted him up and over and let him fall. The splash was loud in the winter silence, and then there was nothing but the sound of water moving beneath ice and the knowledge that Grigori Rasputin, the man who would not die, had finally been claimed by the cold and the dark. They stood there for a moment, these men who had committed murder in the name of patriotism, looking down at the black water where the body had disappeared. They expected to feel relief, perhaps even triumph. They had done what they set out to do, had removed the cancer that was destroying Russia. But what they felt instead was a strange emptiness, a sense that something fundamental had changed, but not in the way they had anticipated. The night was very quiet. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering their tracks, covering the blood in the courtyard, covering the city in white that would be gray by morning. And somewhere beneath the ice, Rasputin's body was sinking, drifting with the current, carrying with it the last hopes of the empire he had served and scandalized in equal measure. They returned to the palace, these conspirators who were not yet sure whether they were heroes or murderers. They cleaned up as best they could, burning Rasputin's coat and hat, scrubbing blood from the floor, trying to erase the physical evidence of what had happened. They agreed on a story, that they had been together all evening, that they knew nothing about Rasputin's disappearance, that anyone who suggested otherwise was spreading malicious rumors. And then they separated, each returning to their own homes, carrying with them the weight of what they had done, and a secret knowledge that Grigori Rasputin, against all odds and all weapons wielded against him, had taken an impossibly long time to die. Morning came cold and gray to Petrograd, the sun barely visible through thick clouds that promised more snow. In Rasputin's apartment, his daughter Maria woke with a feeling of dread so powerful it made her physically ill. Her father had not come home. She had waited all night, dozing fitfully in a chair by the window, watching the street below for any sign of his return. Now, in the weak December light, she knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had happened. She remembered his words from the night before, his instructions about what to do if he did not return. With trembling hands, she called Anna Varubova and told her that Rasputin had gone to the Yusupov Palace the previous night and had not come back. Anna received this news like a knife to the heart. She immediately contacted Alexandra, who was at the Alexander Palace outside the city. The Serena's reaction was one of immediate panic mixed with denial. Not again, not another crisis. Not the loss of the one person who could help her son. She ordered an investigation, demanded that the police find Rasputin immediately, contacted anyone who might know something. The machinery of imperial authority ground into motion, but slowly, because it was the weekend and because the people being asked to search for a missing peasant mystic were not particularly motivated to do so quickly. Many of them secretly hoped Rasputin was dead, that the problem had solved itself, and they saw no reason to rush toward a conclusion that might disappoint them. By afternoon, the police had visited the Yusupov Palace and questioned Felix Yusupov, who denied everything with the smooth confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything in his privileged life. He had been home all evening, he said. He had seen no one. He knew nothing about Rasputin's whereabouts. The police noted the nervousness in his voice, the way his hands shook slightly as he spoke, but they were questioning a prince, a member of one of the most powerful families in Russia, married to the Tsar's niece. They could not simply arrest him or search his property without far more evidence than a missing person report. They left, frustrated but helpless, and filed a report that went into the growing pile of documents related to Grigori Rasputin. But evidence began to surface despite the conspirators' efforts to hide it. A policeman who had been on duty near the Yusupov Palace reported hearing shots around 3 in the morning. Servants whispered about blood in the courtyard, about strange activities in the middle of the night, about their master's agitated behavior. Most damning, one of Rasputin's boots was found in the snow near the palace, a distinctive boot that was immediately recognized. The police returned to question Yusupov more aggressively, and this time his story began to crack. He admitted that Rasputin had been there, that there had been an altercation, but he claimed the mystic had left alive, and what happened afterward was not his concern. The search expanded to the Neva River. Police walked along the banks, looking for any sign of a body or disturbance. On December 19th, 3 days after the murder, they found what they were looking for. A patch of ice near the Pokrovskoye bridge was stained with blood. Beneath the ice, just visible in the dark water, was something large and cloth-wrapped, caught against one of the bridge supports by the current. It took several hours to break through the ice and retrieve the object, and when they finally pulled it free and unwrapped the cloth, they found Grigori Rasputin, his body frozen solid, his face locked in an expression that witnesses would later disagree about. Some saying he looked peaceful, others claiming he looked terrified, still others insisting he appeared defiant, his eyes open and staring as if challenging death itself. The autopsy that followed would become the source of legends that persist to this day. Stories that elevated Rasputin's death from a sordid political murder to something approaching myth. The official report noted the gunshot wounds, the damage from the bullet that had entered his chest, the wounds in his back, the catastrophic injury to his head from the final shot. These alone would have been sufficient to kill any normal man. But the doctors who examined the body made another discovery, one that seemed to confirm every supernatural story ever told about the mad monk. There was water in his lungs. Rasputin had still been breathing when he entered the Neva. Despite the poison, despite the bullets, despite being wrapped and thrown through the ice into freezing water, he had still been alive. His final moments had been spent drowning in darkness, trapped beneath ice, fighting for air that would never come. The doctors also noted something else, something that added another layer to the legend. Rasputin's hands were not bound inside the cloth wrapping, and one arm was partially free, raised up as though he had been trying to claw his way out, to break through the ice and escape even at the very end. They found scratches on the ice from above where his body had been caught, marks that suggested he had tried to push through, had used his last strength attempting to survive even when survival was impossible. The man who would not die had fought until the very moment death finally claimed him completely. When Alexandra learned that Rasputin's body had been found, she collapsed. Not figuratively, but literally fell to the floor of her room, overcome with grief and fear and the terrible certainty that everything Rasputin had predicted was now coming true. Nicholas, summoned urgently from military headquarters, arrived to find his wife in a state beyond consolation, weeping uncontrollably, refusing food, refusing to speak to anyone except to ask again and again who had done this, who had murdered their friend, their savior, the holy man who had been sent to protect them. When she learned that members of the imperial family itself were involved, that Grand Duke Dmitri had participated in the conspiracy, her grief turned to rage. She demanded that Nicholas arrest everyone involved, that they be executed for this crime, that justice be swift and absolute. But Nicholas found himself in an impossible position. He could not execute members of his own family, could not put a Romanov Grand Duke on trial for murder without creating a scandal that would dwarf even the Bevent controversies surrounding Rasputin's life. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on the side of the conspirators, who were being hailed as heroes in newspapers and in conversations throughout the city. People celebrated openly when news of Rasputin's death became public. Champagne flowed at parties where aristocrats toasted the brave men who had saved Russia from the mad monk. In the streets, strangers embraced and congratulated each other as though a great victory had been won. The relief was palpable, the sense that a terrible weight had been lifted, that perhaps now things could improve. Nicholas understood this sentiment, even if he could not publicly acknowledge it. He had his own complicated feelings about Rasputin, gratitude mixed with resentment, appreciation for what the mystic had done for Alexei combined with anger at the political damage his presence had caused. Part of him was relieved that the problem had been solved, that he would no longer have to defend the indefensible or explain the inexplicable. But he was also appalled by the murder itself, by the fact that members of his own family and class had taken it upon themselves to commit this act, had decided that their judgment superseded his authority. It was a challenge to the autocratic principle itself, the idea that subjects could decide who lived and who died based on their own assessment of what Russia needed. His response was measured, almost gentle considering the crime. Grand Duke Dmitri was exiled to the Persian front, sent away from the capital but not imprisoned or executed. Yusupov was banished to his estates in the countryside, forbidden from returning to Petrograd, but otherwise unpunished. Purishkevich was too protected by his position in the Duma and his popular support to touch at all. The other conspirators faced no consequences whatsoever. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily lenient response to murder, and it was interpreted by many as tacit approval, as Nicholas's way of acknowledging that while he could not publicly condone, he understood why it had been necessary. Alexandra saw it differently. To her, this leniency was betrayal, proof that even her own husband did not fully understand what they had lost, did not appreciate that Rasputin's death meant Alexei's death and their own destruction following inevitably after. She insisted on giving Rasputin a proper burial, and despite advice from nearly everyone that this would be a mistake, that it would reignite all the controversies and scandals, Nicholas agreed. They buried him in a chapel being built on the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial residence, in a ceremony attended only by the immediate imperial family and a handful of faithful followers. Alexandra wept throughout, clutching an icon that Rasputin had given her, refusing to believe that he was truly gone, that the voice that had guided her through so many crises would never speak to her again. She placed in his coffin a letter written in her own hand, a final goodbye to the man who had been her spiritual anchor, her advisor, her friend. "My dear martyr," she wrote, "give me thy blessing that it may follow me always on the sad and dreary path I have yet to follow here below. And remember us from on high in your holy prayers." It was a testament to her devotion, but also to her complete inability to see Rasputin as the flawed, complicated human being he had been. In death, she elevated him to sainthood, made him a martyr rather than a murder victim, transformed him into a figure of pure holiness, whose loss was a tragedy not just for her family, but for Russia itself. The people of Petrograd felt very differently. To them, Rasputin's death was a new beginning, a chance for the imperial family to reconnect with reality and address the catastrophic problems facing the empire. Food shortages were worse than ever. The war continued to devour men and resources. The government remained dysfunctional, unable to coordinate effective policy or inspire confidence in its leadership. But with Rasputin gone, people told themselves things would improve. The German woman would lose her evil advisor. The Tsar would take proper counsel from qualified people. Russia would find its way back from the edge of the abyss. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. Rasputin's death changed nothing because he had never been the real problem. He had been a symptom, a convenient scapegoat, a symbol onto which people projected all their fears and frustrations. The real problems were structural. An autocratic system that could not adapt to modern challenges, a war effort that had been mismanaged from the beginning, an economy stretched beyond breaking point, a social order that had lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people it claimed to govern. Killing one man, no matter how infamous, could not address any of these fundamental issues. Within weeks of Rasputin's burial, strikes returned to Petrograd with greater intensity than before. Workers realized that his death had changed nothing, that bread was still scarce and wages still insufficient, and the government still indifferent to their suffering. In February 1917, just 2 months after Rasputin died, the strikes became a revolution. Soldiers ordered to suppress the protests instead joined them, turning their weapons against their officers rather than against the crowds. The Duma refused to disperse when Nicholas ordered it to, instead declaring itself the legitimate government. Within days, the 300-year Romanov dynasty collapsed, and Nicholas abdicated the throne, giving up not just for himself, but for his son, the hemophiliac boy whose illness had brought Rasputin into their lives in the first place. The provisional government that took power immediately exhumed Rasputin's body from the chapel where the imperial family had buried him. They could not allow him to remain in what was effectively hallowed ground, could not permit the symbol of everything people hated about the old regime to rest in a place of honor. His coffin was taken to a remote location in the countryside, and there, witnessed by a handful of soldiers and officials, it was burned. The fire was large and hot, fed with gasoline to ensure complete destruction. Rasputin's body, the body that had survived poison and bullets and freezing water, that had fought until the last possible moment to stay alive, was finally reduced to ash and smoke, scattered on the wind, returned to the earth that had birthed him so many years ago, in a Siberian village that seemed impossibly distant from the palaces and plots that had defined his final years. And the imperial family, left without their healer, without their advisor, without the man who had somehow kept death at bay whenever it came for their precious son, lasted just as Rasputin had predicted. In July 1918, less than 2 years after his murder, Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, and all 4 of their daughters were taken into a basement in Ekaterinburg and executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries. They died together, a family destroyed by forces they had never fully understood, forces that Rasputin had warned them about, but which they had been powerless to stop. The shots that ended their lives echoed the shots that had ended his, and the prophecy he had spoken years earlier came to pass exactly as he had foreseen it. The man who would not die had died, but his death had changed nothing and saved no one. The empire fell. The conspirators who murdered him found no honor in their act, only the knowledge that they had killed a man and accomplished nothing except to confirm that the rot went far deeper. Then one peasant mystic, that Russia's problems could not be solved by assassination and scapegoating. Some of them would die in the chaos that followed the revolution. Others would flee into exile, carrying with them memories of that December night when they had tried to kill a legend and discovered that legends, even when they die, do not die easily. And so the story ends where it began, with a man who walked a long road from obscurity to infamy, who touched both the highest and lowest reaches of society, who healed and harmed in equal measure, whose gift was genuine even if its exercise was flawed, whose life became myth even before his death, and whose name would echo through history as a warning, a mystery, a question that can never be fully answered. Was he a holy man, a charlatan, a victim, a villain, or simply a human being caught in forces larger than himself, trying to survive in a world that was falling apart? The answer depends on who you ask, what you believe, and whether you think the darkness that surrounded him came from within or was cast by those who feared what he represented. But this much is certain: Grigori Rasputin lived, and his living changed the course of history. He died, and his death proved that some men leave shadows longer than their lives, echoes that continue to sound long after the voice that made them has fallen silent. Sleep now, and let his story drift away like smoke from that final fire, like snow falling on the Neva, like memories of an empire that once seemed eternal, but proved as fragile as ice in spring, melting and dissolving until nothing remained but stories, whispers, legends told in the dark to help us understand how everything we think is solid can disappear in a moment. leaving only questions and the haunting sense that we have witnessed something both terrible and true.